with our Law and Licensing Committee. We want to recognize that each of us are here. I'm Matt Hymas. We've got Vice Chair Carey, Member Leanne Wood, Member Carol Lear, and Member Molly Hart as part of our Law and Licensing Committee. We do not have any, and of course staff. Yeah, thank you. We do not have any public comment this morning, so we're going to jump straight into our agenda items. Action item 3.2, and this is R277-114, corrective action and withdrawal or reduction of program funds. An amendment here. We have Angie Stallings who's going to help us.
Sorry. Good morning, everyone. How are you? Angie Stallings, Deputy Superintendent of Policy. This item, of course, has been something that the committee has discussed on two prior occasions. And as you may remember, the R277-114 and R277-100 went to the board last month, and the board requested that it come back to committee because there were quite a few motions that board members were interested in presenting for consideration. So I wanted to help kind of share with you the differences between the versions generally, and then with at the chair's discretion or approval, one of the first questions that the committee should provide feedback on before we move forward is whether we separate R277-114 into the two rules. So as you'll see in backup, you'll see two versions of R277-114. Version or draft 4, I'm going to explain what that is. It is the full rule, not separated out. And what I did with draft 4 is I took what was draft 3, which was presented to the board last month, and essentially accepted all the changes that had been made up until then. And then the motions that board members were prepared to present in committee, as well as a couple of other pieces of feedback as far as requested amendments, you will see in red and blue. So it makes it very easy to see, hopefully, the changes from draft 3 that went to the board last month, and now what should be up for your consideration. And so, of course, as we go through draft 4 or draft 5, depending on which approach we go, I will share, I'll go through the red and blue and just highlight the differences between what was in draft 3 and draft 4. The reason why we have a draft 4 and a draft 5 of 114, they are substantively the same. So all of the red and blue that you see in draft 4 should also be in draft 5. Hopefully we caught all those. We were doing a lot of checking between the two, but substantively there's no difference, meaning there shouldn't be any difference as far as motions or et cetera. The difference between 4 and 5 is that since the November meeting, we've received some feedback that it would be helpful to some to separate the two generally large concepts into two separate rules. And so in general, what draft 5 has is it really is now limited to the corrective action portions of what the superintendent and staff will do by way of oversight and corrective action over the oversight entities. And then R277-111 is essentially the oversight framework. So it takes out, that is how 114 draft 4 is separated into two sections. The first would be the oversight framework, which is 111 draft 1, and then you have the corrective action in 111 draft 5. And again, 111 draft 1 substantively includes all of the same provisions as what's in R277-114 draft 4. So hopefully that makes sense, but I think we don't need to talk about the many drafts depending on what the decision is of the committee. So Board leadership and Committee Chair Hymas did not want to be presumptuous and assume that the full board wanted to separate these out. So Chair Hymas, if you would like, maybe the first decision we could make as a committee is what the preference is, whether to keep both concepts in one rule or to separate them out. And then that way that will help me determine which draft to walk the committee through, if that's okay.
Thank you, Deputy Stallings. Would this be a motion or just a simple agreement?
I think a simple agreement is best because then it would just allow me to start with one
Okay.
draft or the other. So
With that then, committee, can so I brought this forth to staff to split it out. As I was looking through this when it was all in one rule, some people would say, I want to make some motions here or some amendments here or amendments there. And I saw that they were separated. In fact, when I read through it, I thought, we've got oversight and we've got corrective action. And I know that they share elements, but a lot of our rules do. And so I had requested from staff to separate this out. I'd prefer it be separated out. I don't know if it doesn't change a whole lot, but if there are needs that need to be addressed later on, we don't have to bring the entire rule back. We can just focus on either corrective action portion or oversight portion. So with that explanation, is there any concern from the committee about splitting this out? Vice Chair Carey.
Thank you, Chair. Could you walk us through the rationale for breaking this out? Like, why did they start together? What was the logic in keeping them together? And now saying, well, this may make more sense keeping them separate.
Well, I can't speak to the
I could start
the
with the first
origin,
one if you'd like.
but I can. Let me
ahead.
tell you why I again asked to have it split out. Is as I'm working with people who want to make amendments, it's either in one section, meaning the oversight, the strict oversight, or in another, the corrective action. And so as I read through this rule, I thought these are different things we're asking of here. And so I made the request to staff that they split it out. As far as the origin, I think Angie can help with that.
Yeah, thank you. So when we really started discussing this, as staff, it's been about a year ago. It's been quite a process. And because we had our 277-114 already, that is our current corrective action rule. And we knew that a lot of the elements of the oversight framework would need to coordinate. We just started with that default of doing a repeal and reenact of 114. And one thing I should note that's also different in today's drafts that you may notice is we did draft it last month as a repeal and reenact, meaning the whole first 5 or 6 pages is just strike through. What we did, because some people wanted to know what's currently in 114 versus what the changes will be. So we went back and started so that you can see, for example, the language you can see on the screen right now, that is existing language in the rule. And so that way you can see what's there versus what's not. I think that it was just, we thought because they have an overlap to start with it in 114. I personally, after the feedback and separating it out, I can also see the wisdom in that, especially if, for example, the board is ready to go on the oversight framework, but wants to continue to work on the corrective action portions that would allow some flexibility there. I also agree. For example, had we potentially understood if I were starting again, knowing what I know today, I may have just brought the oversight framework separately to see how the board felt about that. And then depending on that action, brought 114 to update accordingly. So I think they're both perfectly fine approaches. I do, however, see the wisdom in when some have much more interest and focus in either the oversight framework or the corrective action provisions. And it does help separate those two conversations out a bit. So that's kind of why we started the way we did.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. No follow-up, Vice Chair Carey.
Maybe one. Typically when I look at the agenda, it says, who's making this, who's bringing it, like what's the impetus for it? Again, I haven't heard anyone, constituent, legislator, come to me and say, we need 114. Can you perhaps provide some background in the sense of where is this demand or urgency coming from?
Can I just interrupt for just 1 second? Because I understand this is not a new question, and I'd like to hear the answer as well. Is this in relation to splitting it out, Vice Chair Carey, or is this something, you know what I mean? Splitting it out or keeping it together, or is this something that goes into the next level of discussing the actual rule or rules if they are split? Does that make sense?
It does. So I was hoping that if I knew where the urgency was coming from, it might make more sense to me to know whether or not they should stay together or
Okay.
be split. That was
Perfect.
but I understand. Thank you.
Deputy Stallings, can you take that question? then?
Yes, absolutely. And there was a document that I prepared and I sent to the board in November, at the beginning of November. I believe I sent it to the full board the week of board meeting last month. It's dated November 1st, and it just states at the top why a board oversight framework. And we could upload that to Civic Clerk. For some reason, I thought it had been uploaded to Civic Clerk, but it doesn't look like it has, but all of the board members received it. In there, you may remember that we reference a couple of audits in there. So there's the Office of the Legislative Auditor's Performance Audit of Public Education Governance Structure, and as well as the Public Education Reporting Requirements Audit that also was done by OLAG. There was also a Office of the State Auditor's audit on minimum school programs. And there was, if you remember, the document mentions the Teacher and Student Success Act, and how there was a difference of opinion between USBE and the state auditor on what the USBE's role in oversight of that program should be. And so the audits, I would say the number one audit that we are looking at is that public education governance structure, and the fact that there's often overlap between USBE and LEAs. And at times there's confusion among members of the public, the legislature,
Chair, may
even
I?
USBE itself.
Deputy Stallings, when
Yeah.
you say we, who is the we? When you said when we were looking at that audit and we thought.
Well,
who-
audit committee. So I don't know if I mentioned in here, but there were conversations about these audits in general in audit committee. Do you want to speak to it, or would you like me to
I
continue?
can.
Yeah.
So we are charged with, as chair of the audit committee, we are charged with following up with those audits. And quite frankly, it seems to be coming from all sides. There's confusion within the agency about what, and it doesn't, that is not a reflection on the job they do at all. It's the question is, what do we need to do about this? It's just not clear in so many cases. Is this our responsibility? Is this something that belongs with the LEA, and the LEA is directly responsible for this? Then when we become aware of issues, what do we do? Because we get caught in this catch-22. You do something, you say, no, these are the rules. You didn't follow them. You didn't follow statute, code, rules, whatever. But then we get feedback that, we get called up to answer why we're holding somebody accountable. We get questions about why we didn't hold somebody accountable. Those lines are so blurry right now for both our board and for legislators. You can pick two at random, and inevitably they come at an issue and they feel completely on opposite sides. So it was a preponderance of the audits coming from OLAG the legislators, our own internal audit findings when we were trying to figure out the lines within our own house, so to speak. And then feedback from the last legislative session where it was really hard to navigate that session. That session was very different. We need to make sure that we know what we're doing both in-house and we know how to properly advise LEAs. It is not fair and reasonable for LEAs to constantly wonder who they're answering to. Are they answering to us? And as long as they've met our quote expectations, they're on the right track? Or do they respond to the legislature? And the legislature continues to offer some signals that they are concerned about how LEAs are held accountable. So it's the best answer is a preponderance of the evidence. It's not one person saying, one legislator or one internal staff member saying that this needs to happen, these lines need to become clearer. It's, man, how much more ambiguity can we take before we accept responsibility for doing the hard work of clearing out those lines? That was very long, but
It was
it
helpful.
tries to get us to where the audit committee weighs in on this as well.
Yeah, appreciate it. Vice Chair Carey, and I know Member Wood had a question as well. And remember, we are on the topic of splitting these out or not. Vice Chair
Yeah.
Carey.
I think that the concerns are valid in that there is confusion. I just don't know if this is the right answer. And when we talk about the legislature and evidence and materials, it was my understanding that we brought up 277114 to the Education Interim Committee. And they didn't say no, they said really no, that they had no interest in looking at this. So, and I get it, right? It's only the Education Committee. There's other legislators that can, they have their own position, but it's the Education Committee. When we went to them head on and said, hey, we think this will make you happy. We think this will address the issues that we're seeing. They seemed less than interested in the proposal. And that was based on my observation of the hearing, as well as, speaking following the hearing to the stakeholders. So again, I agree with Board Member Hart. There are issues. My concern again is I do not believe that this is the solution. But in terms of splitting it, I'm not opposed to that. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Vice Chair Carey. Member Wood.
And to follow up on that, is it not from the public education interim, wouldn't this split be better in the fact that I think the framework was some of the things that they were pushing back on, as opposed to the corrective action plan, where when we had those meetings this summer with these various stakeholders, there were legislators there who very much like the things that are in the draft 5 of 114. Some of those precursor items before you jump to. So in speaking to this discussion, I think splitting them gives us that ability to work with those areas in the correction action plan, kind of those precursor items of giving LEAs a little bit of a break and discussing before jumping into something formal, but also the framework we can work on and in 111 and build that out and maybe gain support in other ways.
Chair, I already used up my time, but I just want to say I agree, just so you know how I feel about it. Let's split them out.
I appreciate that. And that's kind of the intent as well, is that if there's no concerns with one, let's move forward and we can focus on the other. So okay, so we are going to split, and here's how the split works. It's in the backup, but 114 is now corrective action. 111, which is our next agenda item, seeing that we've split it, is the oversight framework. Okay, so we're going to stay on 114 then, and we can go through that, and hopefully we all have that. There's as Angie mentioned, there's draft 5, and there's also different dates on draft 5.
Can explain that as well.
Okay, well, go ahead, please. Yeah.
Start in with draft 5 now. Okay, thank you. So we'll go ahead and start with R 277-114 draft 5. And I'll explain the November 29th date versus the December 6th. I received some technical,
Do you want us to ask questions now while she's going through it, or do you want us to hold off? And I'm okay with either one. I
Yeah.
just want to know what's most time efficient and effective.
She's just going to go through, let's have her go through draft 5, and then we'll open it up for questions, amendments, whatever we can do there.
yeah, that would be great. If I could just explain kind of the general overview differences and review it, I'll kind of review it as an overview quickly. And then we can start back at the top and go more in detail if you'd like, section by section, if that works.
Deputy Stallings, just one, I realize you already said this and I'm sorry. Can you just remind me where the blue came from?
Yeah, that's what I'm going to explain
Okay,
right now, the
thank
red
you.
and the blue. And just by the way, Board Member Carey, I did send the PDF that I sent to the full board on November 1st to Vanessa. She's going to resend it to the committee. Oh, she did. Okay, great. And we're going to make sure that before this goes to the board next month, we also include that as backup so that I know that even though November 1st was just not very long ago, it feels like so many things happen in a month here at USBE. So we'll get that uploaded to backup as well. Okay, so as a reminder, again, a draft 3 went to the board in November, and there were many requests for motions, and so the board referred it. What this is it takes everything that was in draft 3 and essentially makes it black and white. So kind of like accepted changes. It's almost like we're starting with a new version, like fresh. But what you see in red and blue, these are amendments that come from the motions that board members, I had prepared, I think about 6 or 7 motions for that date in November. So it includes that as well as some additional feedback that even came after the board meeting. Some of the difference between, there was a November 29th version of this rule that was uploaded to Civic Clerk, and now there's the December 6th version. The changes are all technical in nature that came from, hopefully you don't mind, Board Member Lear as one, for example, and then the USSA Rules Group. There was feedback we got from just the field, but in my opinion, they were technical, which is, and this is a weighing, this is something you have to weigh, because had this been a draft 1, I would have made it a draft 2 and then put the December 6th. But because we have so many drafts, I felt like they were technical enough in nature that I felt comfortable keeping it as draft 5 and simply changing the date for transparency. I worried that if I created, because I would have had to create a draft 6 and a draft 7, because remember, I made those technical changes to both draft 4 and 5, and I felt like that could be overwhelming to have so many drafts. But I will highlight the differences in the November 29th draft and December 6th in case there are people who reviewed it in between those dates and are wondering what the differences were. But again, I'll note them and you'll see that they're fairly technical. Okay. That's the general overview of what is red and blue. So let's scroll, Ben, if you could, and maybe in a minute I will be able to, my computer has settled and we can switch, but let's go through this for a bit. When we separated out the 2 rules, we changed the purpose statement a little bit for 114. So actually, I believe that lines 23 and 24 might just be a staff correction just because of the separating out of 114 into the 2 sections. But you'll see that the purpose just states responses to compliance and related issues. And so if you'll keep scrolling, in that section 2, that's the definition section, that is just, we changed it to refer to the terms in 111. Now that 111 is going to be the oversight framework rule. We are just cutting it, making this section smaller and saying, make sure and go to 111 so that we don't inadvertently have to change both terms in both places. So we refer to 111. So that's, again, pretty technical. We're just deleting a lot and referring people to 111. Next, if you go to section 3, because again, we split this out, we had to say framework category because the framework information is now in 111. So a lot of the little frameworks was just to make it clear that we're talking about the framework categories. So you can see 64 and 60 through 66. This is new from the board meeting from November. The difference from the 29th and the December 6th version is that on line 65, it said the oversight had adequate time. So we'd missed the word entity. And on 66, we had stated inadvertently the LEA needs additional training. We should have put oversight entity, and that's because the person who requests this language used LEA, and I just moved it over without remembering to change it to oversight entity. So that's an example of what's different between the 29th and the 6th, is that we changed LEA to oversight entity. But all of the rest of this was in the 29th version. I'll keep going there for really, again, small changes. If you go down to 97, this is perhaps one that's on the border of being substantive, but I still think is technical. Somebody mentioned that taking other action as the board determines, that the as the board determines is not necessary since it says the board may take other action. So I was like, yeah, that sounds good. So we incorporated that feedback. Same with lines 113 through 114. These are, I think, all in the spirit of making things clearer, not necessarily huge substantive changes. Because somebody asked me about whether these provisions would impact contracts that other entities had, meaning like DWS or DPS with an LEA. And I said, no, it's only about contracts between the board and an oversight entity. So we have contracts with many entities that aren't LEAs. And so this portion is just clarifying that if there's corrective action, it's all going to be in line with the contract, not with the rule. Okay, and now we'll move to section 5. Again, you'll see that same language that was requested by a board member on lines 130 through 132. And that was a request, I believe, of some legislator actually asking a board member to make that change as well, or incorporate that language. Let's see. Now at about 143 and below, these were amendments that were going to be made in the full board. Not huge changes, but there's some here. For example, there's a striking of lacks a sufficient internal control system that's now been taken out of the rule. And then beginning on line about 152, you'll see some changes there in the language. I think the rest are pretty small. If you'll keep going, Ben, kind of scrolling. Instead of like, we changed it to such as. That was something that changed from the 29th to the 6th. Another person requested typically from the USSA group. And then the last part, again, these are fairly stylistic recommendations on 225 and 226. Instead of must, I agree, it should have been is required to, and then the next one, I guess that's somewhat substantive. If you go down to lines 241, actually, this came from feedback that you received in public comment in November from Ms. Carolyn Charette. She was not, you may remember, she stated that there was not an appeals process, and I actually had an opportunity to talk with her about the language, and she recommended the language on line 241. And so that helps make it very specific that not only that an LEA could actually appeal the whole reason behind the corrective action, not just the individual elements of the corrective action plan. So I felt like that was included in the existing language, but we clarified that to make it sure that it's the whole thing, or as well as in specific parts. So hopefully that's helpful. That's the differences, and happy to
Okay,
answer questions.
thank you, Deputy Stallings. I'm gonna go back between Deputy and Angie. I'm sorry.
It's fine.
You can chew me out later. Committee members, questions? Do you want me to start? Do you
Go ahead.
remember? I'll start.
General question.
I'll hit the button.
Well, I said that so I could get first, but just one question, because based on a conversation I was having with the superintendent yesterday, I just want to make sure when we say throughout the proposed 114, the board, which board are we referring to?
Thank you. And, you know, normally, and this was a conversation I was actually having with Board Member Wood, right, as this meeting was starting, that normally we do not direct the board in board rule. Normally, board rules are meant as the board's tool to direct other people, whether it's the superintendent, which is staff, LEAs, et cetera. This 114, if you looked at the current version of 114, you would not see references to the board. It would all be the superintendent shall, the superintendent, et cetera. Except for maybe in the appeals process, there might have been a reference to somebody can appeal it and the board will review it. There is, in this rule, it's very important to notice, it's very deliberate that when we talk about the board, it is the State Board of Education. It's not the LEA's board. However, there may be references to the local board. If it says local board and it's a little b, that would be either the school district's local board or the charter school governing board. When it's big B board, that is the State Board of Education.
So to be clear, like in line 74, when it says the board or board leadership may work informally, that's not referring to the 15 elected members.
It is.
So when you're saying Utah State Board of Education, you're referring to this 15-member panel?
Correct.
Okay.
And if it says local board, that would be the local school district's local board or the charter school governing board.
Okay. And that was always my understanding, but again, I was slightly confused following my conversation with the superintendent, but that was my general question. Thank you.
Were you asking about the board as a staff versus the board as 15-member board, or were you asking as local board versus
State board?
state board?
I was referring to the 15 elected members versus versus like our staff.
That's what
And I don't like referring to them as staff because they're integral to everything we
Right.
do, so it feels
Right.
odd.
It feels odd, but there is that. I mean, it's one. I've had to think about that many times, but staff have worked very hard and very diligent with me to help me understand that they work at our direction. And so there isn't a time when it's in rule, and correct me if I'm wrong, Angie, because this is my question too. I've spent many years wondering and trying to make this, but there isn't a place where it says USBE, State Board of Education, where it means that you operate separately from the board. It is always the case that it is addressing the 15 of us and then our staff which I hate that too. That's my whole problem. But that the employees at USBE work at the discretion of the board, period. There isn't a time when they work separately from the board. Would that be a fair statement? And this rule does not ever jeopardize that or make that distinction.
Correct. So
Okay.
yes, it's very, I think, deliberate. And in fact, I know it's deliberate because I was there when the legislature did some legislation back in 2015 to really clarify that the duties of this office are in code direct to the board. You know, it says the board shall. There are some, of course, there are a couple of sections about the superintendent, but of course, the superintendent is appointed by the board. And in general, all the duties, primarily all the duties of the office are directed to the board with some mention of the superintendent, and there are some.
Right.
Yeah.
So
But,
it's,
yeah.
it's USBE, the board,
Mm-hmm,
and then it's the superintendent under the direction of the board,
mm-hmm,
and then it's the local LEA
correct.
are the entities that rule is pointed towards.
Correct. And
Okay.
normally, and again, this week I did send an email to board members
Yes.
about something somewhat unrelated, but it did mention the state board's rulemaking authority. And in that section of code, it also states very explicitly that the state board may delegate its duties to the superintendent or staff. And so that is why generally, when you look at the board's rules, you do not see the board mentioned. Because generally, the rules are meant to be that vehicle whereby the board directs staff to do.
Right.
And that's exactly what's happening in 114, is the board is saying, okay, staff, superintendent, we want you, as you're engaging in corrective action, these are the norms we
Right.
would like you to follow as you're monitoring LEAs. Now so anyway, that was
Yeah,
the answer to your question.
Thank you.
Hopefully.
I struggle with the same thing, and that was my understanding, and I just always feel reassured by that. Thank you.
Thank you. Member Lear.
This is getting pretty tedious and we'll never get through it if we perseverate on that. But I have to say that I think it is important to note that on line 74, when it says the board or board leadership, I read that as meaning the board as a whole, not individual board members. I also have to say, just that was my main comment when I turned my light on. And then subsequently, I think it's important to add that I think it is sometimes important for the public generally and for board members internally and staff members internally to see when superintendent makes some decisions that don't require a board vote or carry out duties. So I think sometimes that distinction is important to make, and I'm really glad that more and more rules are saying the superintendent shall, the superintendent may, whatever, because I think that I would think that goes without saying, but for all of those who don't, it clarifies that the board doesn't have to vote on every single staff action that takes place. Thanks.
Thank you, Member Lear. We're going to excuse Member Hart for just a few minutes, so we're running on a 14 committee. Member Wood.
So in this discussion, there was I was also confused, especially as we head into section 3, where the use of the framework for compliance, and that there seems to be 2 sections and thank you, Deputy Stallings, for pointing out the difference between board and superintendent, because I was getting really confused as to where it was going, parts 1 and part 2. So I am wondering and would love feedback from the other members of the committee if I moved that R 277-114-3 be divided into 2 sections, one for board specific action and one for action by the superintendent, and then renumbered, so that it's very clear. There's a section where board or board leadership it's a non-formal process. It's between lines. I think it starts at 81, where it's talking about in those areas of 1 and 2. But this is board. This is our board leadership kind of working offline with these LEAs. Is that something that would be helpful? It would be helpful to me, and
Okay.
I'm prepared to make that motion. But I'd love some feedback before I make votes and cause extra work.
I guess for me, I'm still looking at I don't see the concerns or the need, but I want to understand. I've been looking at this for months, right? And so if you're seeing it, then I'm sure others are going to see it who have not been looking at this for months. So I'm trying to understand where you're wanting to see the divide. I know you said the superintendency. So for example, on line 62, I believe it says the superintendent may, right? But then on line 73, it says for an alleged compliance issue regarding a program or set of requirements, the board or board leadership may. And so, but again, those are already divided by subsection, but you want to, you're requesting to put them in their own section. And remember, Lear?
In informal response to that, I think it's clear because I think, I mean, like I said, this can get so technical and so tedious, but I can read through that section and see sometimes the superintendent can work informally with an entity to resolve issues. Sometimes the board by vote or board leadership could do the same. I don't see that as a conflict or confusing. I feel like it's in the spirit of resolving an issue. It could happen this way or this way. So it doesn't bother me.
I think for me is maybe it's lack of understanding, and I'm at my 1 year mark, so things have to start getting.
You're 31.
Well, thank you. But I don't see, where do we as a board ever engage? Have we in the past in corrective action plans? Is there examples where we as a board and it hasn't been left to our superintendent and staff to move forward and take those into place?
Well, as far as, give me a mic for a second.
Oh, yeah.
As far as hasn't been left, I don't think it's ever, and Angie can speak to this as well. I don't think it's ever just been like the staff will turn it over to the board, right? As mentioned before, the board always works with staff. Sometimes, like when it says the superintendent may, the staff may just do some work and then keep us informed. When it's the board makes the decision, but staff still keeps us informed. I don't know if that helps or not, but.
Yeah, and I'm not aware in my, it's been almost 9 years I've been here. I'm not aware of the board kind of directly engaging in corrective action. So generally it's always staff, and then but the board might direct staff and say, we want you to look into this, or you might have board leadership who ask questions of staff, behind the scenes and says, what are you doing with respect to this issue? I'll share with you why I understand why. So just so you know, subsections 3 on. So as you stated, I think we've been discussing the first 2 subsections, 1 and 2 are about staff, what the superintendent can do informally. And then if they do engage in corrective action formally, you go to sections 4 and 5 of the rule. And then you start with the board. This is, to my knowledge, is the first time we are codifying a process that is more formal and expected, I guess you could say, where the board can now separately from staff, and of course staff's always here to help, of course, but that the board can direct an investigation to take place and potentially engage in corrective action, although that's not the only remedy, in a corrective action plan with an LEA. And some of this, and I don't want to speak for Chair Moss, but as many, if all of us know, he's been supporting focus groups over the last year and has been getting feedback from legislators. I will just say that I personally have observed legislators have been listening to constituents who at times will say, well, let's give an example of a school closure, and there's concerns with an LEA's school closure process, and so then concerns come to USBE and USBE staff. Generally, we do not oversee or monitor, don't have a monitoring program on LEA's school closure practices. So it's not something we would have evidence of noncompliance that we would regularly then engage in corrective action. So the question is then, well, then what? If this is normally a local control issue, just like levying property taxes, there's a ton of what I think most of us consider to be the local LEA's authority. What then? Because now when it comes to staff, if we don't have a monitoring program, that means we're not providing technical assistance. We're not training them on those processes of what to do when they close a school. We're not monitoring, we're not collecting reports on that. Then there's not a position for staff to then engage in corrective action. So this really it starts on subsection 3B. It really, and it's A, it's informal, but B would be the new process because I think the board and board leadership has always had the authority.
Do you have a line number?
Yes, and I'm showing out there, I'm on line 73. So this is new. All this about the board engaging corrective action is something that's new. And it was in response to this, do we need to create an ombudsman, like, in the auditor's office or the governor's office? Because if USBE, and whether that's staff or the board, aren't going to say, do an investigation of an LEA's school closure process, who will? So now this actually gives that mechanism. It answers that question. Instead of the legislature needing to set up a separate office, no, we want to handle this in-house. The board wants to have an opportunity, if there are a lot of constituent and stakeholder concerns, to be able to meet with the board and say, we're receiving these concerns. And you can informally start that process. And then if you get enough concerns, then as you see in B, the board or the board's audit committee could direct an investigation. And whether that's our internal audit, it could be that it's sent to the office of the state auditor. It could be sent to the office of the attorney general. It could be even sent to a district attorney, depending on if something's criminal in nature. And actually, I am personally aware of all those things happening with respect. We've had investigations in the past that have gone to all of those entities. So, but this is actually bringing that more to kind of a process that is expected. And then based on that, if there's an investigation, it might be that the board finds, well, there's no concerns here, it's fine, or you see those other options there. So now I don't even remember what the question was, and I apologize, but it is new.
Member Wood, was it answered? Ish. Let me give.
I do believe, because this is a new section, because we want to stand out that we're trying to take ownership as opposed to leave this to the governor's office or an ombudsman, I would like to see that called out separately. So I'm going to make my motion. It can be voted down with the four of us, but I move that R277-114-3 be divided into two sections, one for board action and one for action by the superintendent. And if there's a better way to word that, I'm open to it in using Deputy Stallings' expertise. But my section is showing what we as board and board leadership, her description there was perfect. That is what I needed to understand, is that this is kind of that extra, because we as elected officials concerns can be brought to us. And we have a mechanism where through leadership, through a vote, we can do other things.
Thank you. Okay, so we've got the motion coming up here. Member Wood, will you just keep an eye on that and make sure we get that correct? Speaking to the motion, I've got Vice Chair Carey. I also have Member Lear. So speaking to this motion to divide, go ahead, Vice Chair Carey.
I love the concept, and I think it's necessary, and I would vote to support it, but just not at this time. I think for me, it's essential to go through this, to see where that discussion leads us and how it revises this. And then for me, again, it would be more appropriate for me to support that motion at the end of that discussion.
Okay, we want to finish.
But that's just me.
We'll just table this motion for the end of this discussion, not another date, just the end of this discussion. And you're okay with that. So we will do that. Does that look correct? And then Member Lear, go ahead.
And maybe this blends in well with that motion, that comment by Member Carey, but I would like maybe Leanne to think about, as we have the rest of this discussion, my concern in separating them out. I could vote for that too. I could support that, but I don't want to create a situation where it's used against the board or used as a as a wedge or as a weapon. Weaponizing has become so cliched. I don't want to say that, but used to say, no, this says the superintendent shall do it. And then, or this says the board shall do it. When really, I think the intention is, as it started out, to say, we should try to resolve this informally. And if that works with board leadership leading the charge, or if that works with the superintendent negotiating. So I just don't want to create a scenario that makes it that creates another difficulty for the board. See what I'm saying? So think about that. Even though I hear you and I can support making it clearer, if you think it's really important and others do, I just don't want it to be another technicality that can be that can cause a problem.
Thank
So
you, Member
maybe
Lear.
think about it during our,
I appreciate those comments. I am in the same vein there of your concern, so I appreciate that. With, excuse me, with that, do you mind if I jump into the rule? Okay. Can we jump to,
And I do have one motion ready for you. Is that?
not yet. We're gonna come back to it. I know. Angie's been great at helping out here. I first want to jump to a couple things that I think are a little bit lighter. And I'm hoping that we can get Member Hart here so we have 5, but I know she got pulled away. But let's jump to 213 if we could. And I don't know if this was made already. Member or Deputy Stallings, we talked about this term at the end, this non-compliant program recipient. And we talked about just changing that to oversight entity. And I don't know if that's just a technical change. I just didn't see it. So I wanted to make the committee aware, the public, whatever. Just you see non-compliant, we're going to change that to oversight entity.
Remake that motion. Or that was the one that I could.
Oh, sorry.
Says, yeah.
So
I can get that motion ready if you want.
Okay.
I can get that ready while you're.
I know I'm going to have you jump around though. That's the problem. Well, that's why I'm asking. Do we need to vote on it, or is that just something that can just be adjusted?
you missed that one.
Yeah.
I don't.
So just a question. So a non-compliant program recipient, those 3 words would be replaced with the oversight entity.
Oversight entity,
Since
yes.
it's already in the definition, this is
Yeah.
who we're working with.
So it start on 209, you'll see it says for an oversight entity that is a charter school, the superintendent shall, then it has these, and it will refer back to the oversight entity. Yeah. Okay.
What line was that again? Because I can.
That was line 213.
you.
So I'm going to put forth the motion since it's right here. We might as well just do it. The motion is that the committee replace non-compliant program recipient with oversight entity on line 213. Seeing no discussion, all in favor say aye. Aye. Those opposed, that passes 4 ayes with Member Hart absent. Next, I'd like to jump to line 189. I'm not sure where the term typically came in, but typically when you use the term typically, it means that it's unclear, right? It means that it gives you flexibility to say, well, we typically do this, but we're not going to this time, right? And in this rule where we're making these adjustments to offer clarity, throwing in the word typically, in my opinion, kind of takes away from that clarity. So my amendment would be to remove the word typically on 189. So it would just read plainly, just so we know what it reads as, requiring more frequent or more intensive monitoring than what is required from the related program.
Just striking typically.
We're just striking typically. That's line 189. So before we speak to the motion that I'm putting forward here is that the committee strike the word typically on line 189. Any discussion to that motion? Member Lear.
I think if I remember from your introduction, Angie, that this was something that was suggested by USBA. And Royce? Or not Royce?
In that meeting.
Oh, I see. I stumbled over that word. It was in a couple of places in the rule. And I stumbled over it too, because I agree with you. But I kind of like the flexibility it retains, and I know that can cut both ways. So I'm not, I don't feel super strongly about it, except that it is not a typical rulemaking word. It's, it's kind of like should and could. So, I'm just out,
We'll keep processing it
Speaking-
and we'll,
I'm just
and I
processing.
appreciate that. and
Okay.
Because it's important. I'm not sure, nobody reached out to me and said, hey, Matt, I want you to put typically in there. I just saw it in there and I thought, again, typically, you don't use the word typically. And when
Yeah,
I
no.
use the term typically, I'm using it to get around something
Ahead.
that is,
Yeah.
so Member Wood.
Well, it seems to me that something is either required or it's not. And what we're saying here is that there are things that are required, and this particular section of 188 or 189 will require more. So the typically doesn't, I guess I'm speaking to your motion. I support this motion because it's either required or it's not. And if it's not required, then we need to look at that over in other places where we've said it's required.
Thank you. I am curious to see why. I know we have a member of our public here with us. And I know that we've decided as a committee to keep these discussions in the committee. But here we are as a committee who have a member of the public. Do we want to keep this within ourselves or allow a member of the public to give us insight?
I'm fine about hearing from Royce if he's, because I'm usually the one that objects, so.
Vice Chair Carey, you have a thought?
Yeah, I think we typically do allow members of the public, so I will.
And I typically would not.
I know. That's why I bring it to the
Which
committee.
is why the lawyer's favorite plant is the hedge,
Yes. Royce, thank you. From what I understand, I want to make sure before we get into this isn't a personal Royce Van Tassel thing. This has been discussed with you and, I'm sorry, the name slipped me, Lexi Cunningham. Yeah, so some,
Superintendents and charter.
yeah, superintendents and charter leaders have got together. Royce, can you help us understand why typically would be put in there?
Sure. Again, Royce Van Tassel, Utah Association of Public Charter Schools for the 3 people online. Typically here was suggested because we had the word more. You are implicitly, you're saying that we're going to do a different level of review than we might otherwise. And so typically was designed to reflect that. You see requiring more frequent or more intensive monitoring than what is typically. And so that was, it's designed to reflect the more earlier in the sentence. That's it. I mean, I don't think anyone is going to get upset if you decide to take that out, but it seemed to go with the more in that regard.
Thank you, Royce. Committee, after hearing that, I'd love to hear your thoughts.
I'd like to speak. in
Vice Chair
favor-
Carey.
Thank
please.
you. I'd like to speak in favor of the motion. Just, again, I think if there's any feedback I receive from our stakeholders, the public, it's just their perceived ambiguity in some of our rules. And I think that by removing typically, we reduce that uncertainty, ambiguity. So I would support the motion.
Thank you, Vice Chair Carey. Seeing no other lights on this, and welcome back, Member Hart. I understand that you just came in the middle or the end of this, but the motion before the committee is that the committee strike the word typically on line 189. All in favor say aye. Aye. Those opposed? Hearing none, that's going to pass. Okay. So
That was, thank you.
I've got one more, or maybe a couple more for me, and then Member Hart has some and maybe other committee members, but let's turn to line 154. Yes, so that's the motion here, is that the committee amend lines 154 to 156 to read each identified violation of law that resulted in non-compliance. I could put law or rule, but rule is law. So it would be repetitive, right? Or, okay. Hey, I'm not gonna, yeah,
It's the reason why in general, when we say law, we want to kind of stick to that is because if at some point we say law or rule or law and rule, and we don't do it everywhere else, somebody's going to say, well, here you didn't think
Okay.
that rule was law, but
yeah.
so, but I understand that for most of the people outside of USBE, they may not initially think an administrative rule is law. However, it is. So
Thank you. And then on, you see, it'll say C, details of non-compliance based on evidence gathered, including dates. Now, I don't know if you have lines 154 to 156 in front of you, it might be helpful to see what I'm replacing or proposing to replace.
did you see? Oh, a little bit, it does.
Oh,
Do you see
right,
it's right
okay.
there in context?
Yeah, it's in context. Okay.
And then this is the motion.
Oh my gosh.
Please, Member
I-
Lear.
When I saw this rule and Angie said I weighed in with some technical amendments, one of the things I suggested to her was this puts a huge burden on staff. And while I take a little bit different, and I've belabored this with Angie over the years, so I take a little different view of rules than some of the staff do and say that I think it's appropriate to have the board, to have it stated in rules what the board can and cannot do. Because I think that gives the public notice. We certainly have that in federal law, that the body, the federal government is constrained in many constitutional provisions, not to mention many laws and regulations. So I think it's completely appropriate that the board's constrained. But my whole point in this, I'm gonna now argue against that point, is to say, I thought this was a huge burden on staff to have such tedious requirements in the rule. And I like making it a little more general.
Thank you, Member
And
Lear.
I think you've found a good balance, because that was her concern, that she wanted to be fair to those people who said it's not clear enough.
Yeah, and that's really where this comes from is clarity for me. I don't like the idea that we could put a corrective action plan on a school without saying what was specifically violated, what law was violated. Now, I would like the clarity to come from the LEA, like, oh, okay, we can fix that. I just lost my train of thought. Not great in this moment, but
Really well.
I know
I agree.
So, well, okay, I'm gonna try to get back on track here, but this is what to bring in the violation of law or violation of law that resulted in noncompliance makes it very clear. We have other avenues in place, and this is where I was trying to get to. We have other avenues in place. If we see an LEA that's kind of veering down the wrong path and we've had some concerns, yeah, we can bring that up. If they haven't broken the law, then why would we put them on we can step in, we can help, but why put them on a corrective action plan unless they've actually done something that they shouldn't be doing? And I think that's where I'm trying to get to with this. So again, you can see where it says in context below the highlighted part, the amendment as it would read in the rule. So we're crossing out issue and the related requirement or best practice a citation to the law related to the issue, all that, and just having violation of law that resulted in noncompliance, very simple in my opinion. And then on C, details of noncompliance based on evidence gathered. That's the amendment. Vice Chair Carey.
Yeah, I like the certainty this introduces. I like the specificity and the guidance. We're giving both sides to that equation. My question is, when we say violation of law, I'm trying to remember another time where we use the word law instead of rule in the meetings that I've been at. And I'm just worried that do we state anywhere in our rules that do we make it clear that when we say law in our rules that it means the rule? Because if we're going to use law here, what I'm thinking is everything we do moving forward is going to say law and not rule. Otherwise, we get into the scenario you outlined, which is why are they saying law here and rule here? So to me, that's a very big change and one that I think we would need to discuss before we substitute it. So I would feel more comfortable until we have that discussion that it's a rule instead of law. Otherwise, we're basically making this decision and wedding ourselves to using it in perpetuity until we can have this. I wouldn't feel comfortable until we have that discussion.
Right. Thank you, Vice Chair Carey. I know that staff will most likely respond to that. Member Lear has a response as well or a comment.
I'll let Angie say this if she wants to, but it says in the Administrative Rulemaking Act, it says that in state law that rules duly authorized, duly, I can't remember the verb, but are considered the law. And that statute grew out of a Utah Supreme Court case in the late 90s.
You can see on the screen that Angie is searching through.
There
She's
she
so
has-
quick at these things.
Well, she read my mind.
Yeah.
But I agree with everything that's being said. I'm just wondering why today we're saying without any again, in law and licensing, I've never heard it discussed. Are we going to use rule or law? Now it just seems like, well, it's here. Let's just do this.
Well, I've been beating on it for like 6 years. So
Okay,
I finally, maybe they heard me
Okay.
or agreed with me or I don't know why, but it says it clearly right in the statute if you look at it.
Yeah.
So.
Because it can't just be our committee, right? Even if as a committee, we say moving forward, we're going to use law instead of rule, we have these other committees. This is all going to come. So I would feel.
So, yeah, let me tell you, this is what, oh yeah, you don't have to jump, but so in my motion, my original motion was violation of law or rule. There have been, and I can't give you the specific rule. I know we've had conversations about it where, or maybe it wasn't in here, but we have said administrative rule. I actually asked Angie, like it says why are you removing administrative rule? It was in here actually somewhere. And because it said administrative rule or law or and law, we removed administrative rule because of what Angie said. The rule is only made because of the law.
I understand.
Yeah. Why now? I don't know.
Bring everybody.
Yeah.
Otherwise, we're saying rule, they're saying law. And I just see confusion if we're not all on the same
Oh, I
page.
see.
I
So
I
then-
agree with everything.
Angie, please.
If I may, I think it's a style. Sometimes, I mean, I'm looking at our current rule and Chair Hymas is correct. I've got the current 114 on there and it does say program means activity required by rule, state law, federal law. All three of those things are quote unquote law. So in some ways it's a style, I guess, preference, but I try to be consistent. And in this case, again, if we want to say rule or law, do we want to start saying state law, federal law, well, case law or constitutional? Then we start having to cite them all. I would say that normally if I'm the drafter, I try to only say law. However, there are times when we're in a public board meeting and somebody makes a motion and says law or, Utah code or board rule. And we did stop it here, obviously, because I had this conversation with board member Hymas yesterday. But sometimes we just let things go because it's not worth the style, taking 15 to 20 minutes on every style preference. Legally, it is, rules are the law. So then the question is, do we say, because this applies to federal law, and so do we now want to say, anyway, when you say law or rule, but that's why here it says administrative law, but it's also saying state law, federal law. I don't think it's a norm that we're just applying today. If you look through the rules, I would hope you're not going to find many places where it says law or rule.
Yeah, and I'm not saying we
Yeah.
use law or rule. I'm just saying if the maker of the motion will accept a friendly amendment, that we say rule instead of law.
It's not.
It's Utah code, federal law. It is not just rule, because this would apply to, like, I'll give an example. In the school fees laws in Utah code, it states that if the state board finds a violation of the school fees laws in code, the state board shall take corrective action. This 114 are the procedures whereby we use corrective action, not just for rule, but also for federal law, state law, et cetera.
So we're using it to be more expansive than rule?
We
It-
take corrective action, and when we have corrective action plans, it's not just rule provisions that are violated. There are provisions of Utah code or federal law that have violated, that an LEA may violate, and then staff create a corrective action plan. And the citation to law the language we're talking about right now is to each identified violation of law. So it could be that they're violating 53, I'm just gonna throw out G2503. I don't even know that's a real section, or it could be CFR 103. It could be board rule. So it's not just rule. It's
So-
broader than that.
So law and rule cannot be used interchangeably, at least not in this specific, because that's what
No,
you're
'cause
saying.
law is larger than rule. Rule's a
Okay.
subset.
So, or is the argument being made that in this particular motion, we need the word law because rule is not synonymous with law? Because that's different than what we were saying, and as I understood it.
Can I try something? Can I try?
Member Lear, go ahead.
Can I try something? This is just my in my head. A chair is furniture, but not all furnitures are chairs. So the rules are law, but you can't use them interchangeably because rules a subset of law.
Right, and may I, Chair? Yeah. No, I understand that and I agree with that. I just wanted to know if we were doing this moving forward or just for here. And it sounds like, as I understand it, this change is for this motion and this rule.
For this rule, yes. And all the things that have been explained, yes. And I think if it comes up in the future and we can have this discussion again, we can, hopefully not as long, but we can, you know what I mean? But I have seen, to your point here, I have seen things where we've eliminated one or the other.
And and I agree.
And I
with
think
I
going forward,
absolutely,
we
yes.
should make it more clear. No, never. You can't.
Last thing. Hopefully to clarify the actual motion, the current language in the rule states a citation to the law related to the issue. Board Member Hymas's preference is that it be stated this way: violation of law that resulted in noncompliance. He verbally stated, do we need to also say law or rule? And then we've had this discussion. So I did want to make it clear there's nothing right now that even in this motion has rule listed. It's been just a verbal discussion because right now the language says a citation to the law. It doesn't say rule related to the issue. And now it's going to say violation of law that results in noncompliance.
Thank you. And Member Hart, you had a,
Yeah, and I'm really hesitant to weigh in because I'm going to show my ignorance very quickly. But my ignorance is shared among practitioners. And it's not ignorance. It's simply trying to navigate crazy waters of, and I'm going to throw all these words in one pot: rules, statute, law, code, blah. When I am trying to do my very best to do what I'm supposed to do as an educational leader, I don't know what the flip those words mean. And it doesn't matter, but I got to figure it out, and I got to figure it out in the heat of the moment. So my interpretation is that there are laws passed. by our legislators at the federal level and at the state level. And those laws, whatever they're called, code, statute, law, I don't really even know the difference. But those laws are then interpreted by this body into a rule. So when I have a problem, I first go to the rule, and then I find the citations that start with 53. And then I go and look those up. And then I try to figure out how to follow all the things that are put in those two documents. Now, as an administrative leader in the schools, we are trying our best. But the more complicated this gets, the less compliance we're going to get at the state board. So we increasingly, and there's a conversation going on right now about a rule based on a law. And now I'm putting on my board hat. We got to stop with this craziness in that managing compliance at the practitioner level is almost impossible. And we should be doing our level best to make it easier, not harder. So there are times where people say, we don't need a rule because the law stands on its own. Fine, I can accept that. That means I got to go straight to something that starts with 53G or something else, I guess. But what I'm trying to add to this conversation is not to forget what we're trying to do in the end. And that is make rules or make, I don't even want to use the word rule because that screws it up. Make guidelines for people to interpret and to be clear to the public about what we expect out of our educational institutions. And so I don't want to get lost in this, that, or the other. I want it to always move towards a place of clarity and effectiveness. Because what's the point of making anything if it's so screwed up? I, as a practitioner, can't even figure out what I'm supposed to do. So I don't like not saying law and rule, because there are places where we have law but not rule. And then there's places where, and this conversation is ongoing, is it appropriate to have a rule that is more expansive than law? And yes, it is, because that's what that's what the code says that we can do. We are responsible for making rules. So to me, as a practitioner, those are two separate things. And if we want to write caps, isn't that what it is? Compliant, action, corrective action plan. If we're going to write those, we need to be able to write them on rule and on law, code, statute, etc. So I'm just saying, will you please think about this from the point of a practitioner trying to implement? That's all. Well, you can educate, but principals and administrators are quitting by the dozen and entering the profession by the dozen, and we don't have mechanisms to train at the level that we need to train on, given the expansive nature and ever expanding law, rule, code, whatever. So please, just when we think about this, think about it as your local principal that I hope you've built a relationship with, your child's principal, trying to do the right thing. And then choose the most basic language based on that.
Do you have an amendment?
No, I want people smarter. I just want people to think from that perspective rather than jargon or something that isn't clear. But I'm telling you, my process is to go to rule and find those citations. So does this rule allow me to do that as a practitioner?
So let
That's
me-
the question.
I guess let me just try to put this in that sphere there. You I don't want to say your school, you have a friend that runs a school and they get this notice from the USBE, this process, which is a fantastic process from what I've read in the rule. And then on top of that, they say, we have a corrective action plan. Here's the law that you broke. Or that you are non-compliant with, or is that enough? Or you're saying,
Okay,
I would like a law, a board rule.
I will give you an example. Open enrollment. I could break the law or I could break the rule. This says violation of law. What if I have violated the rule?
It is the law. What you're saying is it could have a citation to Utah code or administrative rule. Actually, they're both the law.
And I
The
understand
laws- yeah.
that's
Okay.
where I diverged, our paths diverged. When you say that rule is law, that is fine. But I am telling you, the average administrator that doesn't get involved does not understand that rule is law. They believe that rules are administrative rules because it doesn't say administrative law. And there are rules that start with R and there are laws that start with 53G. And you can say they're the same, but in practice, administrators don't do that. And I'm not just talking about me. I'm talking about people that call me because they know I serve both. They make assumptions. They assume that everything that is in law is in rule and vice versa. So if they read one, they believe they've read both. And that's not true. Because that's not true, you have to say both, in my opinion.
Can I maybe offer something that might end this debate here or conversation? I know that it's not popular to put law and rule, but you're saying it provides clarity. We understand as a board, but you're saying the practitioner would appreciate law and rule. And I'm willing to do that for the practitioner. That's why I asked if you wanted to make an amendment here.
I think the body has to decide whether or not we are giving the field enough guidance by saying law, and that when they get a cap and it is not found in 53G, are we prepared to explain that over and over and over again?
We just lost you.
I'm not, it's not regarding.
Remember, Larry, will you hit your microphone? We'd all like to hear this.
No, not really. I said, I don't care because you've got to admit, Molly, you deal with a lot of administrators, but so do I. And I would not say that all don't understand law and rule. I think very many do. And I think very many, because I've been such a repetitive voice of saying, rule is law, rule is law, rule is law, that I think there are some people who finally
Agreed.
It's
That's why I'm
penetrated.
not making an amendment.
so, and I would prefer starting down the road somewhere of saying, let's just start to educate and help them understand instead of having them distinguish, well, these are more breakable than these, because they aren't. And then to Angie's point that she kind of buried was, there's constitutional, going back to open enrollment, you could violate the Constitution. And so we're choosing two pieces when really there are 6 or 8 pieces.
And
Or,
let's,
and we have one piece. So that's the end of my
I'm
tirade.
fine. I'm
Thank you.
fine. I'm not going to offer an amendment. I want it to be accurate with, and this is law, and I am not a law expert. I just
right.
the stance is important to me. I understand that. I will continue to beat that drum. I just hope that we consider, as stakes get higher and as people, are held to extremely high standards, that we make sure we provide all the resources possible for them to fully understand. That's all.
Thank
And I'm
you.
not going to amend it. It's a problem.
Well, let's, I see we have a comment from Member Wood. I'd like to get moving forward since we spent half of our meeting on our first agenda item. I do want to clarify, Director Rasmussen is going to project for us. We're having some technical issues here. But I do want to clarify again, C, again, that we're going to vote on, says details of the non-compliance. So it's not like the LEA is going to get just, you violated 53G, whatever, right? They get details of the non-compliance, the specific conditions that oversight entity must meet as a result of the issues, right? Steps required to satisfy the corrective action. There's additional information that's coming. Okay, Member Wood.
That's where I was going to
Okay.
weigh in, that we have, it's going to be a list. Much of our non-compliance that I've seen in the last year has been federal law with IDEA.
Yeah.
And so law is law. And if we're not educating properly to our practitioners, then we need to do a better job of helping them understand, not
Right.
dumb down our rule because we want to make sure everybody understands. No,
Mhm.
let's raise the boat.
Additionally, the background information that led to the corrective action plan is the first thing. Additionally, we're adding the right to an appeal. So if they do say, well, that's different, we can look at different things, right? There's other steps in play here that will be helpful.
Why are we focusing on law when non-compliance isn't the only issue? We also have things like fraud and waste and abuse. Those things aren't technically against the law, but they are, it's not just non-compliance. There's other reasons we put them on caps. So if we limit it to law, we are changing what we do a cap on, just bringing it to people's attention.
From legal on that? That changes how I look at this.
Yes, the original language, I will say, was broader. And then even when it got to draft 3, it was made more specific, and this motion does seem to make it even more specific. And that was based on feedback that I think some people, and I don't want to speak for other people, receive from LEAs where they actually in some ways want it to be harder for USBE to engage in corrective action. I don't mean to say that, but to make it a little bit of a higher bar before corrective action is imposed. So that the motion in general does take away, for example, there was a reference to best practice. And I have no internet. Both Ben and I, we don't have internet connection right now, so I apologize.
I think we have internet, but we this
Oh, that maybe it needs to be reset.
Google Doc is working fine.
Okay, but I would actually defer to Debbie Davis, who's the internal audit director, to kind of speak to that. I personally have never monitored a program, nor have I ever engaged in corrective action plan, because that's just not my role in this agency. So if Debbie is more familiar with that process and could speak to it.
Please, Debbie.
Okay, so if it's not up on that screen, but you might have it on your screen. So let's see, I'll scroll up. So the reason
I'm wondering, I'm gonna
Oh,
pause,
yes.
Debbie, and I'm trying to be very professional
Yes.
here, but
let's wait.
these are the two that had the question.
Yeah, so let's wait. And I should say, I'm Debbie Davis. I'm the Chief Audit Executive for the board. You sort of announced me, but I can say it as well.
Let's just pause for a second, see if we can get things back up on the board. And I'm gonna go grab a drink, if that's okay.
That's perfect.
I'll be back in 30 seconds.
Pause.
Yeah, let's,
Working on that.
yes, we will take a 2-minute pause. Thank you. Yeah. Sorry, Debbie.
No, you're fine.
And I should say that.
Board member.
Yeah.
This is, so we're gonna come back. We're all most here, but we're gonna, oh, okay. We are here. We're gonna get started again. We're gonna turn time over. We've got some questions regarding the motion that's on the floor. And let me just restate the motion on the floor, then we'll go to the questions as well. The motion that's on the floor is that the committee amend lines 154 to 156 to read each identified violation of law that resulted in noncompliance. That's B, line B, and then C, details of the noncompliance based on evidence gathered, including dates. There have been some questions regarding the strictness, I don't know what the breadth of what we're proposing here. We've invited CAA, Chief.
Yay, Chief Audit Executive. All good.
Chief. We've invited
Something.
Deb Davies,
Debbie.
Debbie Davies, to talk to us a little bit and kind of bring some clarity on what we're discussing here. Thank you.
Absolutely. So Chief Audit Executive Debbie Davis. So if you look at lines 150 and 151, that's where we're saying a corrective action plan shall have these following elements. And I believe the intent in putting that in is that we want the corrective action plan to be clear and transparent to whichever entity is receiving it. You want sufficient detail. So in regards to that, if you scroll back up, then we consider, well, what are the reasons that an entity might be placed or could be placed on a corrective action plan? So that's starting with lines 136. And there are 4 things that are listed. The first is noncompliance with published expectations for program outcomes, allowable program expenditures. The second is demonstrating unsatisfactory outcomes in performance as evidenced by audit or monitoring results, financial fraud, waste, or abuse. And the last one would be not complying with a request to provide accurate and complete program or financial information. So the question then going down to, okay, if those are the 4 reasons you could be put on a corrective action plan, does the detail that has to be included in the corrective action plan sufficiently address those 4 types of reasons for the corrective action plan? If you say non-compliance with law, does that capture all 4 of the reasons that you could be placed on a corrective action plan? Or could someone interpret it to be, well, non-compliance is one, but this is performance related, and I just have to tell you why you're not performing. I don't have to say, well, it's part of your subaward contract or some other detail that would say, this is why your performance is not sufficient, or, this, you are not timely in providing it. So what is the criteria that you're being, that's being considered that you're in violation of? And is it solely just a law that you're in non-compliance of? If so, then the conversation you've had, I think, that it's sufficient. If non-compliance with law is not what those 4 items, if non-compliance is not kind of the genesis behind those 4 reasons for being on a corrective action plan, you might want language that's slightly broader to ensure that the corrective action plan detail will be sufficiently clear and transparent to the entity receiving it.
Vice Chair Carey.
Thank you. And thank you for that explanation. That was very helpful. So in terms of your position and your function at USBE, the proposed change to just use the word law, would that make your job harder or easier in terms of what you do at audit?
For that, Chair. So internal audit always identifies criteria. Regardless, when we're doing an audit, we're going to identify criteria. So I don't know that it would change anything for us. It could change things with whomever is monitoring a program and how they interpret a rule and what they need to put in a corrective action plan, which I think is the bigger portion of what this rule is talking to.
Deputy Stallings indicated that as she looked at this, it looked as more restrictive than our current standard. would you agree with that, that if we make this change, it is more restrictive in terms of what we as a board are able to do?
I think if you talk non-compliance with law, and we were having a kind of a side conversation, could all 4 of the reasons to be on a corrective action plan be non-compliant? It's a little bit harder to draw the lines on that. So my preference would be a little bit of broader language to ensure that the corrective action plan detail will have sufficient detail. No one could come back and interpret and say, was it a law? Was it non-compliant? Anyway, that's just my personal opinion, is that slightly broader language will be I think there would be less room for a misinterpretation of what you're trying to do in the rule.
Thank you. And Chair, I would just want to say that I am all for more definition, more certainty, eliminating that with the entities that we have, general control and oversight for. I am less inclined and reluctant to say I want to make it harder for this institution to exercise general oversight and control. That's our constitutional charge. So as I understand it, I've now heard from 2 individuals that I have a lot of respect for saying this change, I'll use the word may, even though I felt it was stronger than that, may have that unintended consequence. And I think that's a big risk to take, and one that I would be unwilling to take. I would ask Angie or Ben, as we're having this discussion, just to think about what word would best capture without being expansive, but not diluting or diminishing our general and oversight responsibilities. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Vice Chair Carey. We're continue to speak to the motion that's on the floor, and then we'll vote and then move on from there. But Member Lear.
And I can't identify the lines quickly enough, but instead of saying law, could we cite back to that section that outlines that lists the reasons that a cap would be appropriate?
Angie.
Yes, and I just wanted to share with you on the screen kind of the evolution of because really Board Member Hymas's motion is almost like option 3, because let me go back to what option quote unquote 1 was, which was the staff initial recommended language, was actually that in draft 3 was each identified issue and the related requirement or best practice. So that's what draft 3 stated. There was a motion that I had prepared for someone that then did this, what you see in red and blue, which also seems to have, and when I said stricter or harder, and those are very loaded terms, I guess I would say the language, yes, the language is narrower. And interestingly, this is something that as I've been listening to this conversation, I realized that the feedback on this line may have been thinking that it was actually narrowing USBE's authority to engage in corrective action, when really it was only narrowing what's included in the written document that goes to the LEAs, which to Debbie's great, you helped me make this connection, that it might be that we have the authority to do something based on waste, fraud, and abuse, which is above. But then down here, waste may not be a law. There may not be a law that's quite on point. And so that's why you can see that staff said the related requirement, which now we're talking of hierarchy of terms, you have rule, law, requirement, because requirement is actually broader, and best practice are broader than the law. The question is, what do you want staff to put in that plan? Because to Debbie's point, if you're only citing to the law, the question is what comes first, the chicken or the egg? There's authorities here, but if you can only cite to something, what's controlling? So you actually have 3 options. We've got Board Member Hymas's, language. What's in here in draft 5 was a motion that was proposed, or you could actually go back and reinstate the language to the way it was in draft 3. I just wanted to share those options. Yes. Mm-hmm. Yes.
Can I continue for a minute, or I wasn't?
Yes, you have follow up.
I just follow up maybe.
And then, yeah.
I don't like putting best practice in there because that's too much, a bridge too far. But I do like the way that all of those statements, and I'm looking now, I can't exactly decide the lines. Maybe it would be subsection, starting on line 136, instead of law, substituting. So I guess I'm making a substitute or an amendment to Matt's motion, or a proposed amendment to Matt's motion, which would change. Shoot, I can't both look at my screen and look over there.
Well, you said 130.
134-ish.
154?
No, 131.
Paper.
Yeah, so where it says superintendent may place an oversight entity on a corrective action plan.
Okay, so you're looking, yes, you're
136.
up at 136 on subsection 3.
That would be his motion to substitute, because that's not gonna amend his motion. Right now, did you want to amend his motion? Or do you
I
wanna make a
did,
substitute motion?
the part I'm concerned about right now is instead of law saying, to make it clearer and maybe to the practitioner's benefit, using the language in lines 141.
Oh, use the language from these lines.
Not
Okay,
use the language, but just refer back to it.
I see.
Line 141 through 149. And that would be, so I don't know how you do that best, Angie. Parentheses 3, A, B, C,
Maybe just subsection 3.
D. Yeah, subsection D leads into it. So if you wanted to just do that.
So that would be an amendment to mine, right? Or would that just be a substitute? I'm trying to figure this out.
It would be an amendment.
Each identified.
We're changing the word law to items identified under rule number parentheses 3, blah, 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 blah. So
Okay, so you'll have to work with Angie to get that so we know exactly what you're going for here. I just want to make sure it's clear.
violation of, and all they change, Angie, is I wouldn't change that resulted in non-compliance. I'd just say violation of R277-114.
It's not that they're violating 114 though. What if we said, sorry, violation of
Maybe violations.
the related requirement, requirement
Yeah. Requirements
and-
described in.
reason in subsection 3? I'm trying to think.
I'd say the provisions of, or
Or subject.
As described in.
Each identified violation and the basis.
It's basically
For the corrected action plan in subsection 3.
each identified and the
And I know Member Hart had a minute. Is this similar to that? So, okay.
Like that?
I don't know. Best practice is wiggly. People like to claim best practice all over the place. That belongs nowhere in our rule. My best practice is not your best practice. However, requirements does not hit it because, but I'm also going to bring up a concern about internal controls. So, I appreciate especially what CA Davis said about, which is widely misunderstood, the difference between auditing and monitoring. And we have quite honestly more concern with, I have more concern with clearing up the lines for our monitors rather than for our auditors, because our auditors use very, very clear auditing standards. Our monitors are needing better guidelines for their work. And their work can include fraud, waste, and abuse. The word that describes fraud, a violation of fraud, waste, or abuse is the word that I don't know, that I would put with what Carol was saying.
that's why I just wanted to refer back to it.
Yeah, that's, and I like where it's going. Just say a violation of what we said in the above.
And that's what, and is this where, tell me, Member Lear, if this meets what you're,
Violation and basis for the corrective action plan is described.
Because that's those three A, B, C, D, that it is subsection 3. So I'll show you.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah, no,
yeah,
it is.
does it- yeah.
I'm just, what I was sort of paused on was basis.
or
I get-
determination, I don't know.
I'm sorry. No, it's okay. Could you show that in context? Because I am.
Mhm. Yep.
Conversation, but.
come on, Joe. Oh, let me,
Let me do that off the record. Come on, Joe.
so let me ask this, as we're looking at this in context, it's below there. C are you comfortable keeping that details of the non-compliance based on it? So that would stay, that's as part of my amendment, right? Okay.
The basis for the corrective action plan as described in
Subsection 3.
subsection 3. And details of the non-compliance based on evidence gathered. If B and C fit together well enough because there's.
That's what I'm asking.
There's not non-compliance, but I think. These, the.
You could put
I think you
discrepancy.
put violate, I think you, in order to fit, wouldn't you put details of the violation? Because you're identifying the violations.
So just violation, maybe? Okay.
But again, as we pointed out, the identified violation and the basis for the corrective action.
Well, because the subsection 3 doesn't actually have the violations. It doesn't have the requirements. So it's more saying, these are the basis, these are the reasons that the superintendent can.
Makes sense.
Reasons, sure.
It's a better than basis in my mind.
Yeah, I like that.
Well, you know what? I do like that. Because
Keep an eye on, sorry, I don't mean to interrupt. Neither one of you have your mics on, so to the public, nobody knows you're talking anyway. But.
Which is better. That's often better.
Okay.
No, that's better.
I do want to remind, because we keep talking about context. Remember, there is I'm seeing A through H in this section 4. So again, A is the background information that led to the corrective action. B is proposed up here. C is proposed up here. D is the specific conditions the oversight entity must meet. So we don't have to fit it all in C, is what I'm saying.
Yeah, I think that reflects what I'm trying to, get at, yes. Because I appreciate, again, as everyone has said, Debbie's clarification, because I did think everything should be covered by law, and I maybe think we could get there if we were willing to be that circuitous, but her point is well taken, that it's just easier to refer back to those reasons. And I think we do want all of those to be available to a corrective action plan. So that's how I would propose to change your one piece of that.
Thank you, Member Lear. Any other comments to this? Vice Chair Carey?
This could now be a substitute motion instead of a motion to amend. Just,
Okay.
I don't know.
Substitute motion, that's fine, because it's changed everything.
Pretty
I'm-
much.
Yeah.
I
mean,
would just say that in B, we're saying each identified violation, and then in C, it's saying details of the violation, which seems to, there could be a dispute as to whether or not it's a violation. So I like the fact that we use that clarifier identified versus, well, it's a violation. It seems like we're prejudging the matter. So it might be a small thing, but I would just prefer that we be consistent in B and C.
Is this consistent in your, I'm just double checking here. Does this work for what you're referring to here?
Well, C, I would just add the word identified before the word
Details of the
violation.
identified violation. And then I'd ask you to just speak with Member Lear to see if she's.
Yeah. Oh, it's
accepting.
her, yeah. Sorry.
Identified by. Sorry. Leanne's saying something similar to in that maybe violation is not the perfect word because now it's not. So maybe it should be identified issue or concern, or I don't want to make it too squishy, but
Issue, that's what staff did, issue and the related requirement. That was originally.
yeah,
It's
no.
not violation, then, yeah, it's,
The prejudging part is violation.
Issue is like.
yeah.
But I want to make sure that the person, the entity that has the corrective action plan imposed doesn't feel like it's too subjective of a concern.
Yeah. I feel like violation is a fighting word. I think that issue is a more appropriate,
Okay.
it has a better tone to it.
I'm fine with issue as long
I-
as we think that's still strong enough for
It's
the,
I understand the consent. I
Okay.
wouldn't want to say alleged because
that's
we are,
it's too legalistic.
yeah, well, and there is no, I mean, yeah, I just think it's an issue that needs to be addressed.
Okay, so if we change on line, on parentheses B there, if we change violation to issue, is that better?
Are you also okay by instead of saying and, say including the?
Sure. Based on evidence gathered. So I think that is a better motion.
Right.
So now it's the committee, sorry.
So we've got this up here. I hear the violation versus issue. I prefer violation to make it more clear. I think when I hear the word issue, it's like, well, I take issue with that. Well, it doesn't mean it's a violation, right? Typically, yes. Typically, that's not a violation. It's just you have an issue. So I want to add typically, no, I'm just kidding. And rule, yeah.
The judge always wanted to hear it in my.
Yeah, in my opinion. I mean, obviously I had a motion on the floor, so I'll probably vote against this anyway, but that, I just want to make sure that you're happy, Member Lear, with this. I think we've had some great feedback, from staff, from committee members. I think we're approaching a vote here, but I just want to bring up that point between issue and violation that I have.
I hear you and I
Okay.
know what you were trying to do, and I wish I wish there was a word between issue and violation that I could think of readily, that, because I do agree it's a little more than an issue, but it might be short of a violation, which is sort of a conclusion.
We need, there's all these languages out there that have words that we don't have. Let's just insert a Spanish or a French word or something. in
German
there.
has a lot of those.
A German word, yeah, that'll help us out. Vice Chair Carey.
Typically, I would find issue very troubling, but I look at the inclusion of subsection 3, which again, I think limits the range and scope, because as I understand this proposed motion, those issues are limited to those found in subsection 3.
Yes, that's true.
So that's why I'm comfortable with this, but just because we haven't really beaten this long enough, how about if we say each identified compliance issue or each compliance related issue?
How does that work for you, Debbie?
Does that take us back to, again, those four things? Are they all compliance related?
Fraud, waste, abuse.
Yeah, that's Debbie saying.
Answering a question with a question. Isn't that what attorneys do? I think it's, and auditors apparently, yeah.
Yeah, well, I think attorneys are not as rigid as auditors. Or they're, as I've heard before, they're auditors with personalities.
Ouch. Yeah, I don't know if that's a.
Sure, I again, just trying to draw from somewhere. When I'm in front of a parent and a student and I'm talking about an incident that has occurred, when I use the word violation, it automatically brings people to level 10. When I say we have an issue that we need to address, that sets a tone. I'm concerned about tone.
Identified. I think that goes to the conclusion too.
Okay. Let's,
And that's looser than issue, I think.
It is an issue. It created an issue.
The issue's fine.
Prime
Yeah.
time.
Okay. the motion on the floor then is that the committee amend lines 154 to 156 to read each identified issue, including the reasons for the corrective action plan as described in subsection 3, and C, details of the identified issue based on evidence gathered, including dates. All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Those opposed? Aye, no. So that passes 4-1. So that brings us to one more amendment. And Angie, will you speak
This-
to that?
This was one of the pieces of technical feedback or feedback we received as well this week. And now in hindsight, I wish I had just included it in draft 5, but it would have required a lot of edits throughout. The feedback was, why are we using other in the defined term of program or other set of requirements? And the recommendation was to take out the word other so that the defined term would be program or set of requirements, and then amend that phrase throughout the rule. And I actually think it's a good idea as well. So I don't know if you all support that, if somebody would make that motion.
Motion made.
Member Hart makes the motion, and the motion is, the motion before the committee is that the committee strike the word other in the defined term program or
Others.
other set of requirements on line 51 and amend the phrase throughout the rule. Any discussion of that? All in favor, say aye. Aye. Any opposed? Okay, passes unanimously. Yeah, there's no motion on the floor regarding this. So we're still on 114. I'm gonna interrupt for just a second and just kind of go over the agenda moving forward since it's close to 11:30. We are going to move agenda items 3 and 4, 3.3 and 3.4, so that we have time to get to agenda item 3.5, which is R277-304, and item 3.6, the revoke approval status for Wasatch Front Consortium Apple program. So let's continue on. We're still on 114. If we have any more amendments or motions, Member Wood.
So I'd still like to move mine ahead. It can go to a vote
Okay.
if the board doesn't, if the committee doesn't agree, that's fine.
Yeah.
But
So there was a motion made earlier by Member Wood that the committee amend R277-114 draft 5 by, no, that's not the one.
Yeah, that is.
yeah,
Oh, yes, by directing staff to separate section R277-114-3 into 2 sections, one for the superintendent and one for the board, and renumbering the rule accordingly. Speak to your motion, Member Wood.
and it may not be like a new section, like a 3 or a 4. It might be a subsection. Is that,
Right now, the superintendent's in 1 and 2, the board's in 3, 4, and 5.
Okay.
So I think what you wanted was a clear heading, superintendent, and then, right, So,
exactly.
yeah.
So as long as you understand.
I understand. Yeah, I got it. And I'll make that for the draft 6 that will be prepared, with all these amendments incorporated.
So it's just simply stating this is a new area. We've talked about this before. This is a new direction where the board has a little more skin in the game, I guess you could say, because now a lot of times we've kind of passed that on to the superintendent or the staff to make sure this is happening. And this is saying we want to keep some of that to ourselves. So it just makes it very clear.
Tools in the belt. Tool.
Thank you.
It's a new
Um,
tool that I would like to identify more clearly.
Member Hart.
I just had a motion.
Okay, and If I speak at this motion, I'd probably speak against it, not because I don't think it will hurt. I don't know if it will help. So I'd rather just leave it the way it is, but that's just my opinion. So with that, the motion on the floor is that the committee amend R277-114 draft 5 by directing staff to separate section R277-114 section 3 into 2 sections, one for the superintendent and one for the board, and renumbering the rule accordingly. I don't know how this is. We're just gonna do a roll call. I'll start with me. Member Hymas is a no. Member Hart. Vice Chair Carey. Member Wood. Member Lear. And Member Hart.
You could abstain because you were not here and it will lose, but you weren't here for the discussion, so.
No, it's not fair because I wasn't here. So I do need to abstain, but then it's automatically a no because we have silly rules that an abstention is a no, which an abstention is an abstention. Then it reverts back to somebody making a decision that was actually here. A tie break. No, I think there should be a tie break by the chair.
I don't know how passionate any of us are about this, so I don't want to spend a whole lot of
Okay,
time.
I am going to vote no, but only because I can talk to Leanne later and possibly reintroduce it at the board meeting.
Perfect. And you had a motion, Vice Chair Hart?
I had a question.
A question?
Why was 146 crossed off? Because internal control systems prevent problems and we're in the business of prevention. So I'm just asking for an explanation before I, line number
Line
146.
And can I speak to that? Since
Yes,
I
please.
asked for this to be removed.
Okay,
I don't know what a sufficient internal control system looks like, and it depends on the individual, right? I
Uh-huh.
wanted, as you could tell by my original motion, I wanted more clarity. I
Uh-huh.
wanted more, like, this is what it is.
uh-huh.
So when you say something like lacks a sufficient internal control system, well, according to who? How do you prove that? Right? And then again, there's other measures. So let's say they do they're struggling.
Uh-huh.
Then we have other programs such as TSI to help with those internal control systems.
Oh,
I don't
no,
know
no.
if it's corrective action plan.
But would it be would
Rebuttal?
it, well, yes, I have, an internal control system is an actual thing. So what if we took out sufficient?
That's an amendment. I'm happy to entertain anything, but that was,
I-
quite honestly, that was
thank
the
you.
word that tripped me up was what's sufficient and who determines whether that's sufficient or not.
What if it said lacked and articulated?
I think, if I'm open and honest with you,
Please.
I love having it gone.
No, lie to me.
However, I know, right? However, you have a committee here that, so you don't need to convince me.
Oh, I know, but I understand your concern now
Right,
and
right.
I'm trying to process it.
I don't know if it weakens the rule by having it gone or if it strengthens and maybe staff can speak to that. But to me, I don't see why it's necessary. I don't know if we put a corrective action plan or if we just go in and say, no, your control system is weak. Let us help you. And then if they do violate this section 3 or section 3, subsection 3, the superintendent findings, then they'll say, well, clearly you need a corrective action plan. I just didn't see that as part of it. I thought there were other steps that the staff.
CEA Davis, can I put you on the spot? You can answer no, and I am perfectly fine. I'll call you later. You understand my concerns for internal controls, and I believe internal controls, it goes directly with C. My question to you is, would
there are problems. And so you could look at an internal control system separate from the other four things. However, internal control system components are inherent in the four.
So so what you are saying by saying they're inherent, they do not need to necessarily be called out because they are already called out as part of those other issues.
So I would say in considering a corrective action plan, consideration of internal controls, they will have to be considered when you're considering corrective action, which is we're looking at risk, we're looking at ways to improve things. That's what internal control systems attempt to do. Help you achieve your objectives by assessing risk and responding to the risk in positive ways by implementing policies, procedures, hiring the right people, competent people, all of those things, having the right data. So yes.
Okay, thank you. That means I have no motion.
Vice Chair Carey.
Yeah, I'd like to, actually, a few motions, and I'll just make them in the order that they pop up. And I am glad for the discussion, everything that took place earlier, because it did address several of the motions that I had. My first motion will be as it relates to lines 57 through 66. And I would just like to add a provision that says any action taken by the superintendent pursuant to this section I would just be adding like a new line 67.
68.
Yeah, no, like a new line 67. 67 would become 60, whatever the
Oh,
new number would be.
after 66.
Yeah.
A new subsection two.
Gotcha.
Yeah. Yeah, so can we just say for any action? It starts with any action. Let's start it with for any action taken by the superintendent under this section. Notice shall be given to the board of the action taken. As well as a summary of the let me just read that. Any action was under this section, notice, oh,
Are in the rule. I believe there's a requirement for the superintendent to provide quarterly reports. So I didn't know if you wanted, because this sounds like it's like something that you want the board to receive.
yeah,
I didn't know if you wanted to be part of the quarterly report or if it's like within 5 days or
yeah. I'm
once a
gonna put
year. Anyway,
I'm gonna put it, but thank you. Yeah, I saw that, but I'd just like to add any action taken by this under this section. Notice shall be given to the board of the action taken, including summary thereof within 30 days.
So you discarded the idea of changing the notification that's in there for quarterly, or you're doing this in addition to the quarterly?
I was just concerned that, so when I read this proposed rule, I see notice being given to the LEA, the charters, everyone but to the board except for that quarterly report.
Uh-huh.
And my concern is if there's an action being taken with a school or LEA in my district, I just want to be aware of that. And
Sooner than the quarterly.
I think quarterly is very removed.
So
It's
do you
not
want to
actionable.
remove quarterly and put this instead, or are you adding this in addition to quarterly?
I would add this and
Okay.
then we can, my hope is that then we'll revisit the quarterly and say, is that necessary? But in order for it to be actionable, I think we need it to be timely.
Let me ask Vice Chair Carey that what this does kind of put, goodness, some concerns out there, meaning if this passes, each time a cap is considered or a notice is taken, it becomes public,
Sure.
right? So it becomes public every time, because we're talking about 3, right? We're not talking about every time a cap is issued, but every time the superintendent is looking into a corrective action plan. Right, and so whether or not it goes into a corrective action plan, we're making public that such and such LEA is being looked into.
And that was a concern. And if it really becomes, I don't know how many of these pop up in a given month. Are we looking at 500 or 5?
Well, it
Right?
depends on if you're talking about an actual corrective action plan being issued, or are you talking about, again, the superintendent? I mean, you're gonna now getting reports from me every time a parent calls me, and and then I might call the LEA and say, hey, this parent told me this. That's informal.
But
You
if
see,
we-
that's broad.
If we were
every
worried
action.
about this becoming public, we could just use the procedure we have now, which is audit, right? So to me, what it seems like we're erecting this structure to circumvent audit. And by circumventing audit, we circumvent the transparency of the matter. So if the concern is, well, we don't want this getting out into the public, and I can understand why, it's just an allegation, then let's have them submitted through audit where at least we can track and trace those complaints. This system, as I see it, we lose that ability. But we could, I'm okay, and I would accept that as a friendly amendment to say that the superintendent, it says may work informally with an oversight entity. I'm okay just tracking that component. If we're saying that, hey, superintendent gets X, she dismisses 90% of them, but 10, there's a decision that we're going to work informally. I think, again, as the entity charged with the control and general oversight, how do we administer that oversight if we aren't aware of what's taking place?
Yeah, member Wood has a comment to this, also Deputy Stallings and member Lear.
So I would speak against this, especially in the specific section that is in, if you look at 58 through 66, this is our categories 1 and 2. These are those things that, for most part, they will be referred back to the LEAs to work with to resolve. And then this is an informal work. We've heard oftentimes where, sometimes it's a phone call saying, hey, did you realize you haven't submitted this report yet? And the report's submitted and it's over. This is a lot of work going on to make sure problems are fixed before they become problems. And so I would not support this in this particular section.
Member Lear.
Well, I think if I might, Board Member Carey, I'm through the conversation now understanding you're actually wanting to say under subsection 1, because you're not wanting the formal. The formal will be those quarterly report outs. You're wanting some information on the informal.
I'll also be making a motion to the formal, but yes, for the informal, there is, I'm sorry, that's not my term, but yes.
We need clarity.
Yeah, and
We
I
need clarity here.
actually need a little more clarity, only because this is going to be, I'm just trying to think through, I guess I want to share from my experience what I think informal is, informal corrective action. And I wouldn't even, maybe we need to define informal corrective action versus facilitating a constituent concern. So, because I don't do corrective action, right? But let me explain what I think we were trying to say about informal corrective action, and maybe we need to phrase it something differently. So obviously our internal audit hotline is a tool that many people use to file complaints and then they get filled it out. Other times people just call somebody in the office, and sometimes they're parents, sometimes they're teachers, sometimes they're lawmakers, policymakers, and they might say ABC LEA is doing this thing. And we don't think it's the right way of law. And so then will say, oh, okay, well, let me contact ABC administrator and find out what's really going on. So I might call and say, it appears you have this policy on your website and it's out of compliance. It's not up to date. I call the person, most times if it's me, it's the superintendent, but if it's another staff member, it might be a director of teaching and learning, it might be an HR director, et cetera. And then the person's like, oh, I am so glad you brought that to my attention. I didn't realize we were supposed to update that policy. We'll work on it. Thank you for letting me know. Had that been a bigger deal, I mean, arguably we could have said, corrective action, you had a policy that was out of compliance, right? That's more formal. We're actually, so is that the kind of thing you want, would the board wants to know every time I get a call from a constituent who's, or somebody, and then I call the superintendent and say, the ABC policy is out of compliance. Those are the kind of reports you want us to give. And if so, I just wanted to share what I think the unintended consequences are. Number one, I will personally start just asking those parents to do the hotline and then go through that process, which will be fine. I will say it might take more time. It might seem very bureaucratic from the parent's perspective. It also then, sometimes just calls between me and a superintendent and things get done like within a day or two, right? I don't mean to say I have this power, but once you start doing something that's a little more formal, people are much more careful. They take more time. They respond, well, we don't believe this is a problem because of this. That, and I think it will burden, I think staff will be much less inclined to provide any technical assistance. Like I might just say, I apologize, but I'm not, hotline done. And we won't necessarily reach out directly to the HR director, the administrator, the teaching to say, it also will create kind of this more formal, in order to get change done, it'll be a bureaucracy versus a conversation. So that's it. And hopefully I'm not overblowing it. And it might be because I'm using my personal experience, but I also am sharing that because if you're not as concerned about a call like that, maybe we could call that something separate from informal corrective action. And maybe informal corrective action is a notch higher than what I just described. Mostly, I just want to say that language that's currently in subsection 1 is not in our rule at all right now. There's no requirements on staff. It doesn't say staff. Yeah.
But Deputy Stallings, that's exactly when I spoke with you before. It's my understanding that all this is happening now. And what we're doing with 114, or what we're trying to do with 114 and 111, is to make it a formal process. That's what I've been told by staff at USBE, that, hey, this is already happening. We're just trying to institutionalize it with formal rules. So yes, if we're going to formalize it, the purpose isn't to create work, but if we're not measuring the complaints that are coming in, if we're not measuring how many informal resolutions there are, how do we as an elected body ever know what those issues are? And we talk about education and awareness. Earlier with board member Hart, she was saying, whether it's a law or a rule, we need more training. What's happening is that never bubbles to the top, right? That never comes to our attention because you're informally banging this out every day. So if we're going to formalize the process, we measure our programs. This now becomes a new rule. It launches several new procedures. I think it's absolutely essential that we measure those to know their efficacy. And the other thing is it does create this black hole where there's no transparency, that the superintendent can start sending things into this black hole that the board never becomes aware of, not because it's nefarious. And I told Superintendent Dixon yesterday, I said, I'm going to be calling out the superintendent position all day on Friday. I said, don't take it personally. Even if it were Matt, I would probably double the procedures, but it's not personal. It's just, how do we exercise oversight if these things are just being done and we're not measuring? So that's really the end goal. And I'm already, willing to dial this back and say, maybe it isn't every call, but those where we do this informal agreement of resolution. And if that amendment needs to be made, I'm happy to make that. But I appreciate the chair taking the time. I know that efficiency is a hallmark of this committee, but these changes are not just affecting one program. They change everything about the way this institution operates. And I
So-
think because of that, you know, it deserves the time that we've taken to discuss these issues.
Let me just ask Vice Chair Carey before we go to Member Lear. I hear what you're saying, and you're talking about an oversight. You're talking about an oversight framework, which, since we've split the rule, what you're proposing here just refers to 114. If you're looking at a general oversight, and we're talking categories 1 and 2 here, then I think your motion is going to be better placed in 111, not 114. Am I wrong here? Because 111 is now our general oversight where we categorize, and you're saying, I want feedback. I want to see if the system is working or how it's working, whatever. That's just from my perspective, where I would think that those amendments would be made.
But the category 1 or 2, the superintendent shall refer reports and complaints back to the oversight entity. That's in 114, as is the superintendent may work informally with an oversight entity to resolve an alleged compliance issue. That's why I thought it was appropriate here. And again, this isn't about framework. It's just about reporting. It's just about making sure that the board is aware of those issues that the superintendent is working to resolve informally. Now, the breadth of that, I think, you know, we can work out later, but I do think we need a reporting structure, because this is one of the easy ones. Once we get to line 73 and 75, there is no process outlined there. So I think it's important that before we say, let's just do this, we really need to make sure that we're measuring, is it working? Is it working correctly? But again, the reason for this motion is transparency. I just don't want a black hole where we're receiving complaints, and then I bump into someone, or I have a meeting with someone at WSD or OSD, and they're like, hey, did you hear? And it's, well, no. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Vice Chair Carey. You've got a motion up here on the
Yep.
screen. I want to make sure that it's saying what you're hoping it says. While you're reviewing that, Member Lear.
2 comments. First of all, the state board, as I understand, is a governing board, not a managing board. As such, the state board hires an executive who is the superintendent, and the superintendent in these rules, and especially it comes out in this rule, is a catch-all or a euphemism, you can call it several things, for staff, superintendent and staff. So it doesn't mean literally just the superintendent. And we hire a superintendent hires her staff, and to do the work that we are discussing in this rule and in a lot of other rules. I believe that is the transparency. That is the governing board's opportunity to do it right. Because I agree with Angie, partly because I've been in sort of her position to say that I know how many phone calls come into her office, and she's one of these collective superintendent members. So I don't want to hear about every one of them, and I don't want to chill their opportunity and their ability to work with any of those people who call, those entities that range from legislators to people on the street to students. I don't want to chill their ability to work with those people and clear something up, or right or wrong, or provide information. So I think as a member of a governing board, my opportunity to do this right is to hire a good superintendent who hires good staff. I don't want to be a managing board. I don't think we're intended to be a managing board. And consequently, though I believe in transparency, I think there has to be work done in a staff and office and superintendent context that we don't hear about on a regular basis. And because we have to trust the superintendent. If we don't trust the superintendent, that's a different discussion. So I hear what you're saying. I just think this would make our office much less of a resource and much less valuable to the general public.
Yeah, and I don't know what percentage of the work the USBE does would fall into a framework category 1 or 2, but the way I'm looking at this, we lose visibility on all those issues. At least when they go through audit, we can see it, we can track it, and we know what's happening. Here, as I understand this rule, if it is in a framework 1 or 2 category, all that work happens without one note or data point coming to the board. How?
The governing board's role.
But our charge is oversight. And if I don't know if I don't know the data coming in, I just don't know. So, and I understand, yeah, and I understand, like, we don't want to burden them, but even if we say we don't want well, I'm going to keep the motion. I'll amend the motion to read that, action taken by the superintendent under, subsection 1B. And that will eliminate all the calls. It's just those where it's informally done. Sure. Well, you tell me. It says the superintendent may work informally. I don't know what that means. If that's just a phone call or if that means it's ongoing.
Share something.
But
Yeah.
again, it seems that there's a lot of ambiguity here. And again, I don't know why we would deprive the board, the elected board, of that visibility, right? Again, anything in category 1 or 2, approximately how many board rules would fall into those 2 framework categories?
Maybe half.
So 50%.
I'm
I
guessing
understand, but even if it's 40%,
200 rules.
yeah, so 100 rules we now lose visibility on, in the sense that if they're calling up with an issue or complaint, this board loses oversight on those complaints because there's no formal process to let this board know, the elected board know, these are the calls that are coming in. This is how it was resolved. And that information is valuable, not because we want to go out and say, oh, look at this LEA, look at that bad LEA. And again, I'm getting in my discussions, I'm getting the impression that we need this rule not to really make it more efficient, but to kind of shield LEAs for mistakes. And I don't think that warrants, everybody makes mistakes. We have a process, and I'd rather take the process we have now, or at least we have some feedback, over a process where people are making the same complaints, but we don't keep any track of. So.
Matt, I don't see any other lights. Can I call the question?
Okay. Calling the question. We've got a motion. The question's been called. We have a motion up on the board here.
Just end it at period right there.
That's still, I want to make sure before I read this that Vice Chair Carey, the maker of the motion, is this is what his intent is.
Oh, the only thing I would add is at the end, on a monthly basis, or every 30 days.
Okay. So,
Better.
Okay.
so the motion before the committee is that the committee add the following after lines.
Question? I'm not sure I want to call the question.
Well, it's committee. I don't know how, I don't even know how you, okay, let's,
I can't vote, is what I'm saying.
okay. We can vote
No, I
on,
mean,
well, how do we have a majority vote?
Vote. I just,
But calling the question requires a 2/3, so I guess what's 2/3 of 5? You have it.
We need 4, but
Stop this agenda item and refer it to next month if you'd like, so we can get to the 3 or 4.
Did I say that out loud?
well, don't worry. Yeah, only we heard it. So I there's a request to call the question. I agree with Angie here. I mean, there's a lot that goes into this motion here. It's not as simple as a monthly report, which I would love to have, but I think it's more complex than that. I think we know that it's more complex than that. It's not a secret. And I'd like to run through or at least have an idea of what that looks like, what that does to not just staff, because staff are fantastic and they typically, I know I use that word, they typically do what we request of them, even if it's inconvenient. They make it work. But I'm also worried about, as was brought up before, LEAs making things public that don't necessarily need to be made public. And so I'm wondering if we can find a way to say, yeah, let us know, keep us informed, not so that we can go in and correct staff and say, oh, you're doing it wrong, you should have done this or that, but keep us informed while protecting the dignity of the LEA and then go from there. So that's kind of where I sit. I would like to work more on this, but I do understand we have time sensitive items on our agenda, more time sensitive than this. And so with that, what is the thoughts of committee?
I am going to vote no, but I would like the committee and anybody watching to know that I am going to work, if he's open to it, with Vice Chair Carey to come up with some idea to address what I'm perceiving to be the issue, because I do believe there's an issue there. I just don't think that the way this is stated fully, I think it creates some unintended consequences that I'm not comfortable with. So while I'm going to vote no, I am going to want to come up with a different motion that we bring to the full board. Also, if it passes, I would say the exact same thing, but that would just be letting people know I would be doing amendments to this. So we can go either way. I don't care.
Vice Chair Carey, go ahead.
Yeah, and I want to thank again the chair and the committee. I know we spend a lot of time on this, but again, I think it's because of the weight of what we're doing. And so I have several motions. What I would propose, following up on Board Member Hart, this committee has always found ways to tackle difficult issues in an effective way. And I think that's because everybody gives a little. I am more than happy to sit down with Board Member Hart, Board Member Lear, Board Member Wood, and staff and just work through some of these on an informal discussion basis. We could probably get more done that way than this formal process. So I'm just putting it out there that I'm happy to do that. And it might be more effective. So when we do come back, we're not going through this step by step, but I'm happy to do it either way.
If there are a lot, we can also consider asking for an additional meeting so that it's in the public forum. We can do either way. I do think that both these rules are attempting to address the realities of the current situation, that the current climate that we find ourselves in. It's almost in a way modernizing and addressing our current reality. It may require an additional public meeting. I know that's not anybody's favorite, but in trying to move these ideas, the foam and address the concerns that the field has with caps in general, it is obvious that there's quite a bit of conversation. We don't like additional meetings, but it may be necessary. That's all I'm saying.
I'd like to, if the committee is willing, I'd like to table 114, 111, and 100 for our January meeting. That will give us a month to work on this. We can still bring it back in a formal committee meeting. I don't know if we need to cram another meeting in before Christmas and New Year's, right? This isn't really a great month to Well, some of us have spouses that will kill us. So I'm not saying who. I have a friend. Yeah. And children, yes. My children are teenagers. They don't care. So is that a motion that I would make, or
Can I ask a,
please?
one more? Remember, Carrie, if you would give us your motions in advance, that'd be super helpful.
Yeah.
So, because if I could have responded to this in multiple pages that you would have loved to have read before, and maybe it would have provided some context and background. And so I would just love your motions in advance. And I'm also willing to informally have any discussion that anybody invites me to.
Yeah, I just want to say that I have been gathering information which precluded the formulation of the formal motion because I didn't want to make them unnecessarily. And, even getting responses today to some of the questions, like I didn't know that over half of our rules would fall into this category, a category 1 or 2, which to me, approximately. Yeah.
Without numbers anymore, I'm sorry.
So, yeah.
Except you'll just make a report to us monthly.
So if that works for the committee, I'll move to table these to our January committee meeting. And just out of curiosity, we've already made some amendments. So would you create a draft 6?
I can do that with what's already passed.
And I'd like us to be able to work off of a baseline where we all can reference line numbers at the same time. So if that works for staff, that would be helpful. So the motion before the committee now is where, do we need to vote on this first, on Member Carey's motion?
Well, you did a substitute.
Okay, so the substitute motion is that we table agenda items or action items R277-114, R277-111, and R277-100 to our January meeting. All in favor, say aye. Aye. That passes unanimously. Thank you, committee. This is important. I appreciate the time. I don't know how much I appreciate it, but I do appreciate the comments, the feedback. This is important. We do want to get this right. And so I think, Vice Chair Carey has spoke to it a couple times. This is worth taking the time because this does impact LEAs quite a bit. Now, we are going to jump to agenda item 3.6. This is an action item, revoke approval status for Wasatch Front Consortium Apple program. We have Malia Height, who's going to cue us up for this.
Okay. Hi, Malia Hyde, Executive Coordinator of Educator Licensing. And we are seeking that we're actually, due to some new information that came in late yesterday, we're going to amend the recommended action. So the Wasatch Front Consortium is an Apple program, an alternate pathway program that has been approved. However, due to a number of candidate complaints and also as a result of their corrective action plan that they have not yet met the conditions of, it now has been 13 months since they've been put on probation. We suggest that the committee recommend to the board to revoke their approval status. They are potentially voluntarily closing prior to board action in January. And so we would like to request that the committee recommend to the board to revoke approval status of the Wasatch Front Consortium Apple program if they do not choose to voluntarily close, and direct staff to work with the educators who are currently enrolled in their program so that they may complete their professional learning plans to obtain a professional license so that those educators aren't left in the lurch, that they have a plan going forward.
Thank you, Dr. Hyde. Vice Chair Carey.
Dr. Height, how many educators are currently in that situation? If you had that data, I didn't see it.
There are 51 candidates currently enrolled in that program.
That would be affected by an immediate closure. Is that the?
Yes, so
Okay.
they would need a pathway to get to their professional license. And so that's the second part of the motion.
Understood. Thank you, Dr. Hyde. Thank you, Chair.
Vice Chair Hart, or yeah, Member Hart.
I appreciate the backup documentation that was included with this. It makes it clear. We need to make sure that we're providing opportunities to our prospective teachers that prepare them for the classroom appropriately. It is not easy to do an Apple program, not just simply because training teachers is hard. And there are lots of resources out there for Apple programs. It's fairly flexible, and it's becoming more and more flexible by the day. I am I think that it is our job to make sure those programs are exemplary. And this one, quite frankly, is not, for a variety of reasons. I am prepared to make that motion unless committee members had additional questions. And the entities involved in this are wonderful educators. This is an additional task that just didn't work out for this organization. And I just think that it's appropriate, and we will make sure those educators are just fine.
Yeah.
Yes, so the
Chair,
motion is
let
made.
me- Let me speak before you make the motion, this is never an easy thing, and I want to be brief here. This is never an easy thing. And it's a sad moment, because this was designed to help get teachers into the classroom that were well trained and prepared, and it just didn't work out. I appreciate staff's work. I mean, Dr. Height says 13 months of work on this. Nobody wants these to fail. This is a difficult motion to make. I'm appreciative that Member Hart's going to make it, but just to put in my sadness, concern, whatever, at the same time, it's a shame that this one didn't work out. But I am happy to hear that we can assist those educators that are in the program so that they don't just fall off. We have a plan for them that they can still continue on to get their professional licenses. So anyway, Member Hart.
And I do know that it's an agreed on almost situation. So it's not I guess it's what's important for me for everyone to know is that there are issues recognized on both sides. It is not, USB did not turn off the spigot of support. So I move that the committee recommend that the board revoke approval status of the Wasatch Front Consortium Apple program if the program does not voluntarily close, and direct staff to work with enrolled educators to complete their established professional learning plans.
Thank you, Member Hart. The motion before the committee is that the committee recommends that the board revoke approval status of the Wasatch Front Consortium Apple program if the program does not voluntarily close. And do we need to have a date closed by? I think that might be important.
Well, it would be after the board.
Yeah, it would be after the boards. Yeah, January 15th, maybe.
Okay. Are we okay if we add that in there? Okay. So the motion before the committee is that the committee recommends that the board revoke approval status of the Wasatch Front Consortium Apple program if the program does not voluntarily close by January 15th, 2024, and direct staff to work with enrolled educators to complete their established professional learning plans. All in favor, say aye. Aye. Sounds like it's unanimous.
Oh, sorry.
No, now it sounds unanimous. Thank you, committee members. Yes, let's jump to agenda item 3.5. This is R277-304, teacher preparation programs. This is an amendment. And we're going to invite Ben Rasmussen to join us. We're actually going to invite Lisa McLaughlin
Oh, Malia, looks like.
and Malia. Please.
Thank you. So we're presenting to you today two sets of revised teacher preparation and competencies to incorporate into board rule. We have had competencies in there, but in the past, so we are requesting a revision. And these revisions are prompted by feedback from the field and the desire to align our competencies to the new Utah Effective Teaching Standards that the board approved in June. Both sets of competencies were developed and defined by several committees over a period of about a year. These committees were made up of teachers, instructional coaches, program faculty, and parents. The draft competencies were then released for 30-day public comment. And then the first set is a revision to the general teacher preparation competencies, which we expect all teachers, regardless of their license area, to meet. And then before they're recommended for professional license. And then the second set of competencies defines elementary content areas. We already have literacy competencies, so this will define competencies in math, science, social studies, physical education, health, and fine arts.
Thank you. Do committee members have any questions regarding the competencies or the rule itself in front of us? Can I just ask, the rule itself, like I said, you just updated it to match what we're doing with the competencies
Yes, and technical adjustments.
and technical adjustments, yeah, because there's not a whole lot of color here. Yeah, right. That's the meat of this, is incorporating. Okay. Member Wood.
Just one question. My directs to staff. Okay, thank you. Are these through the professional programs? So you've had higher ed weigh in also on these committees, so they're prepared to make sure these happen?
Yes, we
Okay.
actually had two committees. They were made up mostly of university and then Apple, and there was some overlap, but we made sure we included all
Oh,
kinds
Apple
of-
too. So you
yes.
have, everyone had the buy-in. Perfect.
Yes.
Thank you.
Mhm.
Thank you. I would accept a motion if there is one. If we get one up on the screen.
Yeah.
Member Lear?
Let me just say before I make that motion that I did talk to Malia and got a good explanation of this and actually proposed some kind of technical changes that they just incorporated and felt good about, so that I felt like it was clear, and they were just mostly grammatical technical things. So with that, I move that the committee approve R277304 draft 2 on first reading and forward to the board for approval on second and final reading.
Thank you, Member Lear. The motion before the committee is that the committee approve R277-304 draft 2 on first reading and forward to the board for approval on second and final reading. All in favor say aye. Aye. Any opposed? Passes unanimously. Thank you. Committee members, we are at 12:12. And I know it's going to take longer than 3 minutes. I would love to have this discussion on public hearing policy recommendations. If the committee is willing to offer 15 more minutes so that we still have 30 minutes for lunch. Is that acceptable before the committee? I believe it is. And I think you added an extra taco.
If it's not, then no, because it'll take longer.
All right. Well, we'll say that it is. If it's not, then I apologize.
But I'll be crabby. I mean, I can make this maybe pretty quick.
Well, and that's what I'd like to turn time over to Member Lear. She had some thoughts on our after our public hearing on things that we could do. Well, I'll let her explain it. Will you just hit your microphone?
I'm trying to think where to start. I mean, I've had this concern for years, watching these public hearings where there was an established policy by a previous board that we don't like these public hearings. And I'm sorry, I'm going to give you a few of my impressions and you can take them as that. But we don't like these public hearings. They're sort of interfering with our work, but they're required under the Administrative Rulemaking Act. So we'll sit here stone-faced and hear what we have to say, and it'll be exactly an hour and then we'll be done. And I have always been troubled by that. It continues as I became a board member, and then as my board member service continued, we're all sitting there. We've got a lot of informed people in front of us. We have staff members who have definite opinions on some of these issues, and somehow the hearing process doesn't allow for any of that discussion or exchange. I still personally would like to see some way to make this a more productive learning experience. I was persuaded by some of the information I received, generally from Mr. Cannell and the information, well, I wanted to say research he did. And I don't expect him to do exhaustive research of every single agency that holds these hearings, but I know that I've seen hearings, maybe by a different name, in other entities where there is more give and take. Even so, the majority of the information he found, by far the majority, was that there was not any give and take. And his, I think, the conclusions I reached from the information he provided was there wasn't a very good way to do this without putting staff in uncomfortable positions and creating confrontation maybe with the public. And so I'm willing to just be frustrated that this is a waste of time that I think we could use more productively. But I right now, in the heat of everything else we're doing, don't have a proposal that won't take hours to hammer out. So as far as I'm concerned, I appreciate the information that I received. And I've thought a lot about this, and I don't have a good solution from this, except I'm still left with some frustration that I think we should be able to have a better give and take when we have so many informed people sitting in one place for an hour. So I'll just leave it at that. And I mean, obviously this is the body's, either the committees or the board's discussion now, so I can't just withdraw it, but my urgency is passed. I've expressed my concern. I do still think we need, I'll just conclude with this. I think we need a policy that says, here's how we handle public hearings, rather than this is the way we've always done it. And it's uncomfortable for staff. And I'm not I don't want to be flippant or minimizing the staff's concern about that. I feel like I wish we could have more of a discussion approach to this situation.
Thank you. And I don't know, like you said, you've looked through the options. I looked through the options as well, and it's like, yeah, it would be great to be able to do this, but right, like this is what we're giving up, right? This is the risk that we're putting people in. Vice Chair Hart.
I do agree that we should have, I don't like the notion of we've always done it this way. And so we're just going to pass it down through an oral tradition of how it's going to work. I do think that it should be, what's the word? It should be codified, a loose, there should be some written guidelines. My question is, have you considered, instead of substituting or changing public hearings, have we explored very gingerly and carefully the notion of facilitated roundtable discussions? A different structure, instead of fitting it into a public hearing, but instead very controlled roundtable conversations about issues. Has that ever come up? I just don't know.
Can I ask a question to go along with that? Would that be, are you imagining some formal board?
Mm-hmm. Or,
roundtable, similar
or-
to what Jim did this past summer?
no, 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 no. I'm
Okay.
talking about, very issue-driven, narrower with a, facilitator, a public policy facilitator, with, controlled processes like, and it doesn't, and not necessarily full board, but perhaps subset. And then particularly invited guests and people that are interested. I wonder if there is a structure. I agree. I don't think it's in the public hearing, realm, but I do think it's needed. And we need to try a few things and maybe even fail, with a few, you work with the willing. That's how you start something new. And I think there's people that would be willing to try a couple of new structures as long as they were, excessively controlled. And then as the pieces that experience success, remove those scaffolds, I would be willing to explore that option. More controlled than a town hall, less than a public hearing. But what I'm saying is, I do think we need to move forward with making a rule out of public hearings or making a process that is somehow documented. I think that's one issue. The other one is, I don't think we should put it to bed. I think the urgency has passed, but not the need. So I would be interested in working with anybody that wants to on something like that. Just,
That was right. I agree with you, Molly. I would be willing to work on that going forward. I think there maybe there's an opportunity for that, and I agree. A facilitator, I think, is a good idea. And I do also still support the idea of a policy. I think it can just be a policy, not a rule, that spells out, this is the way the board holds public hearings. And so there's no expectation that the board members can ask questions or have any interaction. And we're clear with those who are requesting hearings, this is what it'll see. So I'm thinking that the staff can just move forward with a rather simple policy that
Can
spells
you-
that out.
would you be willing, could you address the issue of writing up a policy for, I'm not sure what the look that Rasmussen is sending me. Okay.
Oh, it's not
But if we could
complicated.
move forward with maybe
It's just
a policy,
that
just
memorializes what we're doing.
exactly. Thank you.
There we go.
Sorry. No, you're good. Deputy Stallings is going to respond, and then Member Wood has a comment.
So yes, what we will do, I was just talking to Ben about timing, and I know that the backup says we'd bring something in January committee. We're requesting it come in February, if that's okay. So what Ben will do is prepare a draft board policy with the existing process. And then, actually, I think a good part of waiting until February is that if there are some ideas that it feels like people are solidifying or coming together on, maybe he could prepare a draft 2 so that you've got the existing in draft 1, and then draft 2 could be, these newer ideas of a roundtable or whatever you'd like. But for sure, we could have a draft that codifies our existing protocol, which we agree as staff is needed and would be a great idea. And if the committee is okay with us bringing that back in February, we'd
Would there
appreciate
be
it.
any wisdom in waiting until March, or April, since it's after the session? I know, but we're
have public hearings, and that's what I wanted.
okay. All right, fair. Then it's not wise.
Member Wood.
Take 10 minutes.
I just wanted to thank,
Me.
yes, Member Lair, you, for bringing it forward as a discussion item, because I had a lot of, when she first talked about doing this, I wondered why, well, why can't we have more question and answers? You know, in the last one, I would have loved to have justified why I made the rule because the intent of what the public was saying was so far off of my original intent of what we were doing. And you kind of sit there and you feel a little bit of attack, but that's not my intent. That you want to, and so all the information, just the basic research that was done and brought forward and the whys behind it was so helpful to understand. Sometimes we just have to do things. Yes, it's the way they have been done, but that there is, my husband has a saying at work before you move the fence post, find out why it was put there in the first place. And I think that this is one of those reasons where we realize why it's there, because it protects our staff, because it protects us from getting put in a position of, so I'm just grateful and wanted to say that publicly.
Thank you, Member Wood. Thank you, committee, for the discussion that we've had today, the discussion on this 114, the other action items that we've gone over. Appreciate your time and patience here. I move to adjourn. All in favor? Aye. Passes. Thanks. Meeting adjourned.